Chapter 324. After the officials of the 8th Bureau of the Overwatch Council took the two scholars away, Escher Tavern became much quieter. But the wine made the scholars brave, and not long after, they began to talk noisily again. What they talked about was nothing more than the rumors about Commissioner Fan's past. The Yi family was guilty of treason. After the mysterious mistress passed away, all the family property was taken into the palace treasury. Someone said worriedly, "If young Sir Fan really is that mistress's orphan, I think this is going to be troublesome." Treason? Then why did the shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall keep him so white and fat? A scholar with thick eyebrows said mockingly, "I think the imperial court took advantage of the time when there were no widows and orphans to forcibly seize the family property. Now that the Yi family suddenly has an heir, I think the imperial court will panic." Panic? Didn't His Majesty want Commissioner Fan to manage the palace treasury? The palace treasury belongs to his family. How can he manage it? The palace treasury? Another snorted, "I think Commissioner Fan is going to be out of luck soon." The shopkeeper wiped his cold sweat and came over. "Gentlemen, can you keep your voices down? If the men of the Overwatch Council hear this, how can I keep my little shop open?" The shopkeeper of Escher Tavern rarely came out to see guests, but today he came upstairs. A few familiar guests stood up to greet him. The shopkeeper looked around and listened to the drunken gossip. Escher Tavern was the property of the Chui family. Recently, the Chui family was on the verge of collapse. Suddenly hearing the rumors about their enemy, Commissioner Fan's past, the Chui family couldn't help but be secretly delighted. They watched the situation develop. The young man who claimed that the court had seized the Yi family property was indeed bold after drinking. He laughed and said, "Shopkeeper, what are you afraid of? Can the Overwatch Council really shut the mouths of the world? Even if they dare, His Majesty won't allow it. Look at those people who were brought back to the Overwatch Council yesterday. Didn't they come back safe and sound today? It's just a small talk. It's not like they broke the law." The man next to him still looked worried. "Commissioner Fan, this is not going to be easy. If he really is a descendant of the Yi family, his career will probably end here." In reality, these words were not completely said. After all, they were not officials and were in a restaurant in broad daylight. No one dared to speak the true judgment in their hearts. In these people's hearts, they thought that after the court learned of Fan Xian's past, they would first take away his position, and secondly, they would probably take away his life. What about Fan Manor? The man then sighed and said, "Minister Fan has managed the Ministry of Revenue these years and is a famous and capable official. Is his family going to be ruined because of his romantic debts?" After the rumor entered the capital, other than speculations about Fan Xian's past, the thing that the people of Jingdo talked about the most was the Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian. They talked about how he had tricked the mysterious mistress of the Yi family into his hands, and how he had caused her to secretly bear a child. Everyone knew that Minister Fan had been a dissolute ace on the Lu Jing River, but they did not expect him to have the ability to attract the mistress of the greatest merchant in the world. But as the rumor spread, the young ladies and pretty daughters of humble families had developed a completely different feeling about Minister Fan. Back then, the Yi family had committed a great crime of rebellion. Fan Jian, who was a low-ranking official at the time, had been able to keep the child he had with that woman alive and had not been discovered by the people of the palace. He had taken great risks to raise the child for so many years. This story seemed to be enough to be rewritten into a novel, and it had the potential to become a popular romance novel. Until now, people seemed to finally understand why Fan Jian had kept Fan Xian in Danzhou for 16 years and had not allowed him to enter the capital. Seeing the panic of the 8th Bureau of the Overwatch Council, people knew that this rumor must have been very accurate. But with the Emperor in power, Commissioner Fan was not Shen Pingping. He could not cover the sky with one hand, and he did not dare to invite all the chatty people of the capital to the 8th Bureau for tea. In the end, he could only watch in shock as the matter gradually spread. For example, the people who had been arrested yesterday had been released today. This was clear proof. As a result, people no longer resented the young Commissioner Fan for doing something so taboo as sealing the way of speech. Instead, They felt a trace of sympathy for this young official, whose future was uncertain and life and death uncertain. After all, Fan Xian had gained a very good reputation in the kingdom of Qing over the past 2 years. Regardless of whether it was inside or outside the city, he had won a lot of face for the court. Thinking of his imminent misfortune, the common people still had some feelings for him, especially when they thought of his mother, who had disappeared without a trace because of a groundless case of rebellion. The Yi family? Which Yi family? At this time in the restaurant, a young man suddenly asked stupidly. He had been listening for a long time, but he still did not know the origin of the Yi family, which was related to Sir Fan Jr. After all, the events of that year had happened too long ago. Time flowed like water, and too many people in the kingdom of Qing had almost forgotten that shining golden name. You don't even know the Yi family? Some of the older people began to laugh disdainfully. As expected, they were just some kids who hadn't even fully grown their beards. They didn't even know the once illustrious Yi family, and yet they all felt the need to teach the other a lesson. The Yi family was the greatest merchant in the world back then, the middle-aged man leisurely said. It was the Yi family that made glass and sold it as silver. Someone objected, thinking that this point was not made clear. The Yi family that made soap and perfume. Oh, the perfume has been discontinued for over a decade. You probably haven't had the luck to smell it. The Yi family, the only family that can make strong alcohol. Someone else added, the Yi family that provided a large portion of the military equipment for the court back then. Do you know the palace treasury? Do you know where the Qing kingdom spends so much silver every year? The middle-aged man laughed mockingly. The palace treasury earned it from northern Qi, from Dongyi, and even from the sea. And what is the palace treasury? Isn't it the property of the old Yi family back then? The young man who had asked the question was flabbergasted. He opened his mouth wide and said, "My God, that's amazing." The bravest scholar, who had pointed directly at the court and seized the family property, shook his head and laughed coldly. If the Yi family was only a merchant, how could they have developed to such a scale back then? If they were only a merchant, how could they have been destroyed? The middle-aged man asked curiously, "Oh, perhaps you know some news." The Yi family. The scholar shook his head and sighed. Rumor has it that they have a close relationship with the Overwatch Council. When the Overwatch Council was first established, it was said that all of the income was provided by the Yi family. Of course, this is only a legend. The middle-aged man was silent for a moment. Suddenly, a light flashed through his mind. He said to the people around him, "Everyone, do you remember the stone tablet in front of the Overwatch Council's door?" Everyone nodded. Suddenly, their expressions changed as they thought of something. They all cried out in surprise. Could it be that the person called Yi Qingmei was the mistress of the Yi family? The scholar's expression also changed slightly. He sighed. No wonder Sir Fan Jr. would rather give up his noble and scholarly reputation and sully his body to work in the Overwatch Council. I'm afraid he knew about this. He said with surprise. Sir Fan Jr. was secretly the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. This matter has always been strange. Did Director Chen already know? Before he finished speaking, the middle-aged man had already hurriedly shoved a wine cup to the side of his mouth, blocking his next words. After a moment of shock, the scholar also felt a lingering fear. The people of the Qing kingdom were simple and straightforward. The common people and scholars were not afraid of the officials, nor were they afraid of Sir Fan Jr. Otherwise, they would not dare to gossip about him in the restaurant. Only the old man in the wheelchair was feared by everyone like a ghost. They did not dare to talk too much about him. The restaurant finally became truly quiet. Everyone began to drink and eat. After an indeterminable amount of time, they suddenly heard a surprised voice coming from the corner. Everyone was startled and turned their heads to look. They found that it was the young man who did not know the glorious history of the Yi family. They saw him stand up with incomparable excitement. He danced with joy and said, "I remember the Yi family. I remember. The Yi family that was the second in command." Everyone laughed and paid him no more attention. For most of the common people of the Qing kingdom, the Yi family had already become a name in a pile of old papers. No one would purposely preserve its existence in their memories. Even the people in the restaurant of Esher Tavern, if this had happened 2 days ago, perhaps would not have remembered the many changes that the Yi family had brought to the Qin kingdom. But after the rumor that Commissioner Fan was a descendant of the Yi family entered the capital, everyone talked about it too much. Only then did it gradually awaken their dormant memories. Only then did they begin to remember the Qin kingdom after the Yi family appeared. It seemed that the Qin kingdom before the Yi family appeared was far too different. Perhaps it was just a young lady of a manor beginning to miss the smell of perfume. Perhaps it was just a guard at the city gate remembering the wonders of soap as he bathed. Perhaps it was just a soldier staring at the crossbow in his hand in a daze. Perhaps it was a merchant in Shangjing in the north carefully cleaning a glass horse with a silk cloth. Perhaps it was a poet gulping down strong alcohol and feeling endless joy in his heart. Perhaps it was the old man from the Overwatch Council lifting the black cloth to look at everything in the world. Perhaps it was just a young man remembering the first firecracker he set off as a child. In any case, because of the rumors regarding Fan Xian's past, people began to think of the Yi family for one reason or another. Fan Xian walked out the door and welcomed the rare warmth of the winter sun. He stretched lazily, and a refreshing smile rose to his face. Because of this matter, it was not convenient for him to return to Song Mountain. Following his father's wishes, everyone in Fan Manor pretended that nothing had happened. They watched everything indifferently and welcomed the whispers of the people around them. Deng Ziyu walked over and handed him today's council reports, as well as the private reports from the Qinian unit. Fan Xian read through them in the sunlight and asked, "Regarding that rumor, are there any movements from the officials in the capital?" Deng Ziyu peeked at the calm face of the commissioner out of the corner of his eye and felt great admiration for him. Such a big thing had happened, yet he was still able to keep his composure. Was he not afraid that the palace would immediately send people to arrest him? He did not know of Fan Xian's anxious appearance on Song Mountain, so he couldn't help but think even more highly of him. When they first heard this rumor, Deng Ziyu and all the officials in the Overwatch Council and the common people were equally shocked and incredulous. But after thinking about it for a while, they realized that although there was no evidence for this rumor, when compared to Fan Xian's actions after entering the capital, it was very believable. If he was not a descendant of the Yi family, why would the director love the commissioner so much? If he was not a descendant of the Yi family, why would Minister Fan make such a plan to have his own son take over the palace treasury? There's been no big movement. Deng Ziyu was blinded by the sunlight in the garden and woke up from his daze. After apologizing, he said, "The news from the various manors is very clear. The Imperial Censorate has already secretly contacted them, but last time they suffered a big loss, so this time they seem to be more cautious. Instead, in the other departments, some officials have begun to stir. But rumors are rumors, after all. Without concrete evidence, they don't dare write anything to say. Everything is still in the dark." Fan Xian asked, "Is it the Eastern Palace?" Deng Ziyu shook his head. The officials who are on good terms with the Eastern Palace are still observing. But yesterday, a few officials' wives entered the palace to see the Empress. After they returned, the officials also met in private. As for what they said, no one knows. The Empress? Fan Xian furrowed his brows and sighed. He didn't even have time to find trouble with the Empress. Were they going to come to him of their own accord? The Empress would naturally fly into a rage, but what would the Empress Dowager think? It was only now that he realized that the power he could use, other than Uncle Wu Zhu and that final trump card, was not very secure. In this situation, even if he relied on the Emperor's trust in him and Chen Pingping and his father's plan to safely get through this, what about in the future? The situation had to be controlled in his own hands. Only then could he be at ease. In Hongguang Palace, the Empress sat by the Empress Dowager's bed with a face full of tears. She held the old woman's hand in her hand and said pitifully, "Aunt, you have to make a decision for me." The Empress Dowager sighed and said, "How can I make this decision?" The Empress gritted her teeth and said, "Usually, I have always looked at Fan Xian with fear and trepidation. Now, I finally know that he is that witch's son." The Emperor, The emperor is so cruel to hide it from me for so long. That which has a descendant. The empress dowager stroked the empress's messy hair and comfortingly said, "It has already happened so long ago. What is there to be worried about? You've also seen that brat. It's impossible for His Majesty to give him any title. You keep fighting, but what can you fight for?" Hongguang Palace was completely silent. Other than old eunuch Hong standing guard at the door as if he was asleep, all of the eunuchs and serving girls were far away from the palace. Worry about it? The empress was about to cry. The wrinkles at the corners of her eyes appeared. "Aunt, have you forgotten my father? He is your brother." Although the emperor has always refused to say, how can we not guess the reason? Isn't it because of the matter of killing that which back then? He has always held a grudge. Hearing the empress say this, the empress dowager's face immediately darkened. She struggled to sit up from the bed and said in a stern voice, "Shut up. In this palace, you should call me Mother Empress, not Aunt. You still have the face to talk about what happened back then? I don't know what kind of jealousy you ate to actually incite your own father to do such a thing, to kill off the entire family. The emperor only told me a few months ago that if Fan Jian's family had not been quick to act and sacrifice dozens of lives, not only would you have killed that woman, you would have also killed Fan Xian." The empress dowager moved her face closer to the empress and coldly said, "Don't forget, although Fan Xian is that woman's son, in his bones flows the emperor's blood. No matter where he is still the flesh and blood of the royal family. If you want to kill him, you have to ask me what I mean." The empress shivered in her heart, and endless fear surged out. She looked dumbly at the empress dowager's righteous and awe-inspiring face and thought, wasn't it the empress dowager's tacit consent for us to kill our way in a Taiping courtyard? Why are you not willing to admit it now? Seeming to guess what the empress was thinking, the empress dowager's expression relaxed slightly. She lightly said, "There are some things that must not be said. Take it with you into the earth." The empress dowager's eyes filled with anger. She looked at the empress dowager without a sound and rudely said, So even the proper empress dowager is afraid of her own son." The empress dowager's cold gaze stared at the empress's face and said, word by word, "It is not fear, it is love. I cannot bear to see the emperor as grief-stricken as he was in the past, and I do not want another night of Jingdo's blood to flow. The royal bloodline has always been thin, and most of the nobility have already been lost. They cannot endure such torment again." The empress sat in a daze for a moment. Suddenly, she giggled crazily. "Cannot endure torment? My pitiful father, your pitiful brother, died for nothing. Fan Xian is the son of the Yi witch, and the court is not giving an explanation? Are they just going to let the court and the people discuss it? What is the Yi family? The Yi family's crime is treason. Are you not worried that the royal family's face will be completely lost?" The empress dowager slowly said, "You are tired. Go rest. As for Fan Xian, who said he was Lady Ye's son, I don't believe it at all. As for the ignorant people of the world, if they want to say it, they can say it." The empress finally gave up. Her hands gripped her handkerchief tightly inside the sleeves of her dress. Forcing herself to stand, she bowed to the empress dowager and turned to walk out of Hongguang Palace. Just as she was about to reach the palace door, the empress dowager's cold voice rang out. "I heard that recently the wives of officials have often come to visit your palace. It is almost the new year, and there are more matters in the palace. You are the mother of the country who controls the 6 palaces. Don't always worry about matters outside the palace. That is all. Go." The empress turned around and bowed again. With a cold smile at the corners of her lips, she bid farewell and left. Go watch her. Her temper has become more and more strange these years. The empress dowager sat on the bed. Her trembling hands barely managed to gather the silver strands in her hair. She ordered old eunuch Hong in front of her. "Don't let these things bother the emperor." Old eunuch Hong made a sound of assent and left Hongguang Palace like a ghost. The palace door creaked. The eunuchs and serving girls who had received the order quickly entered to serve the empress dowager. The little hand of a serving girl holding the comb slowly and carefully moved through the silver hair. The Empress Dowager suddenly huffed coldly and slammed her palm on the table. The serving girl combing hair was startled by this sound. Her hand shook and pulled out a few strands of silver hair. She looked at the hair on the comb and was frightened out of her wits. Without thinking, she knelt down and repeatedly kowtowed, not daring to say anything. "Rise," the Empress Dowager said with her eyes half closed. "I'm not an old creature who cannot tolerate people." She forcefully suppressed the anger in her heart, but she could not calm it for a long time. The emperor had asked her to suppress the empress because after the night of bloodshed in Jingdo, most of the people related had died. Only the empress knew the true relationship between the Yi family girl and the emperor. Only the empress knew Fan Xian's true identity. If the empress was allowed to do as she pleased, no one knew what those princes would do after they woke up from their fright. Thinking of the Yi family, the Empress Dowager's temples began to throb. A bitter pain began to spread. The Empress Dowager had always thought that the Yi family girl was a curse that would linger around the Qing royal family for countless years. Unexpectedly, this thought had been imprinted on her. She had left a child for the emperor. The Empress Dowager had enough power to deal with this matter. Otherwise, the Yi family would not have been destroyed back then. The old woman's impression of what happened back then was bad enough. After she learned the truth from the emperor's mouth, she remembered that Fan Xian's mother's surname was Yi. Her head began to burn with pain. Thus, when Fan Xian entered the palace a number of times, she avoided him. She could not guarantee that she could show the benevolence that an Empress Dowager should have. When it came to how to deal with Fan Xian, there was a world of difference between her and the Empress's thinking. For the Empress, Fan Xian was, first and foremost, a Yi family girl and the son of her mortal enemy. In the Empress Dowager's eyes, no matter how wrong the Yi family girl was, how many crimes she committed, and how evil she was in the court, the son she gave birth to was, after all, the blood of the royal family. He was her own grandson. Late at night, after confirming that old eunuch Hong had already returned to the small room outside Hongguang Palace, the pale-faced empress gently bit her lip and gave a meaningful glance to her serving girl. In a moment, the crown prince of the Eastern Palace, who had recently appeared steady and had not made any mistakes, arrived in front of her and bowed in greeting. He didn't know what the empress was saying. He only heard her lowered voice become more and more urgent, but the crown prince shook his head the entire time. Mother and son faced each other in silence. A moment later, the crown prince quietly comforted, "Mother, even if Fan Xian is a descendant of the Yi family, so what? He is nothing more than a merchant." "Merchant?" The empress smiled coldly. "Do you think that woman is a normal merchant? She is a demon." The empress stared at the crown prince and said in a cold voice, "Fan Xian is your father's son. If you want to know what happened next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 325. Late at night, the palace was dangerously peaceful. Hearing the empress's words, the crown prince almost fell to the ground. His face was full of shock. He stuttered, "Mother, what nonsense are you talking about?" The empress's expression kept changing. After a long silence, she said quietly, "Fan Xian is the bastard child of your father and the Yi family's witch." The crown prince shook his head, unable to accept this sudden situation. He shook his head for so long that he felt dizzy. Only then did he sit back down on the bed and mumble, "How is this possible? How is this possible?" Thinking that he had a younger brother who had been wandering among the people since he was young, the crown prince felt that life was truly wonderful. Furthermore, this younger brother was often seen in the capital. His reputation was even greater than his own, and the power in his hands seemed to be no less than his own. He unconsciously jumped up, perhaps to comfort himself, or perhaps to relieve his stress. He laughed foolishly. "So I have a younger brother like this." The empress looked at her son as if she were looking at an idiot. The crown prince's face heated up. Embarrassed, he lowered his voice and roared, "So what? My relationship with him has always been good. Furthermore, his background is not proper, and he can never enter the palace. He is no threat to me." "No threat to you, your highness?" The Empress laughed coldly. Don't forget, his mother's death is inextricably linked to your poor mother. Do you think he will just watch you sit on the throne? Even if he is magnanimous enough not to seek revenge, is he not afraid that you will deal with him after you take the throne? Fan Xian, even if it is to protect himself, he will not let you take the throne. The Empress' voice was like a curse in the palace. So, Goner, you must be prepared. Of course, you cannot spread such critical information. The most important thing is that you cannot let your brothers in the palace know of Fan Xian's past. Otherwise, if eldest brother and second brother, the crown prince understood what his mother meant. His voice became a bit erratic. No wonder the rumors outside say that Fan Xian is a descendant of the Yi family, but father has never come up with a way to punish him. So, there's more to it than meets the eye. But mother, if father continues to favor him as he has in the past, and he has the support of the Fan family and Director Chun, it will not be easy for me to touch him. The Empress Phoenix's eyes were cold. Of course, we can't touch him now. Our power is too weak. No one in the palace is willing to help us. So, you can pretend to be courteous. But don't believe that your wild brother will have any good intentions towards you. Endure. From today onwards, you will obediently endure. Don't do anything unnecessary. After the spring examination, you were right. No power is as important as your father's love. As long as the Emperor still trusts you, Fan Xian won't dare to do anything. As long as we endure until the future, there will be a way. The Crown Prince was speechless, but he didn't agree with his mother's thoughts. The sky brightened. In the porridge shop, the people gossiping about the Fan Manor and the Yi family continued. The first bureau of the Overwatch Council, which monitored the movements of the officials, was on guard. Everyone in the Fan Manor pretended to be calm amidst their fear. The Emperor had a headache, and so did the Empress Dowager. Minister Fan arrived early at the Ministry of Revenue Yamen. His expression was the same as yesterday, and he talked cheerfully and wittily. There was nothing strange. Chen Pingping did not return to Qinggarden. He stayed in the Overwatch Council and watched everything that happened in Jingdo with his slightly muddy eyes. The sound of sweeping came from the street. Fan Xian had followed Sir Fei's prescription and was taking his medicine on time. In his hands, he held the nameless martial secret in a daze. He had long finished practicing the first volume, but he still hadn't found a way to practice the second volume. Particularly now that his Jinqi had completely dissipated and his meridians were riddled with holes, he didn't dare to follow the description of the second volume to forcefully move his Jinqi. As for the matter of his past, Fan Xian's state of mind had already calmed down. The sky was going to rain. His mother was not married and had a child out of wedlock. Let her be. In any case, this matter was not his responsibility. If the palace's fear of his mother was so strong that they wouldn't even allow him, the transmigrator Fu Qinggan, to stay, then why should he care? At the worst, it would just be a battle. If, when the Emperor's orders came, he could not command the Overwatch Council and Qinian unit, and he had no more Jinqi, and things had reached the most dangerous stage, then don't blame him for listening to his teacher's wishes and going against his mother's wishes. He began to spray poison on mosquitoes and use poison to open up a bloody path. He used a large knife to chop ants and a heavy sniper rifle to take down a few grandmasters. Yi Luyun was not in the capital, and it was difficult for the army to exert its strength against a small number of people. He couldn't imagine who could keep such a strange combination. At this moment, Fan Xian's heart actually calmed down. He gradually began to feel a little bit of the atmosphere of that little girl called Yi Qingmei, who had brought the blind uncle in that box against the entire world. He was a little nervous and a little excited. Of course, it would be best if it didn't develop to this stage. After all, he still had to consider the interests of the Fan Manor, the safety of his father, sister, and wife, as well as the life and death of many people who were on good terms with him. When the map was drawn, the dagger was revealed. It was only the last move. To be able to maintain the current stability was Fan Xian's most urgent need. There were still many things he hadn't done, and those things had to rely on his current power and position. For the next 2 days, no one came to visit the Fan Manor. Even the people who were closest to the Fan family wouldn't choose to come at such a time when the wind and waves were at its peak. What was strange was that King Jing didn't come either. According to the secret report from the Chinian unit, the gardener prince, for some unknown reason, threw away his hoe and bucket of manure. He only leaned against the railing in his manor and drank. Old tears streamed down his face as if he was feeling something. The officials who were on good terms with Fan Xian, including Xian Chuwu, Rin Xiao, and the other junior ministers, were all watching carefully. They were waiting to see how the court would react to this rumor. No one dared to make any statements at this time. In the palace, Lady Ning was wearing a well-fitting dress. Under the warm winter sun, she was walking in circles around the withered tree. This was a habit she had developed for many years. This female prisoner of Dongyi in the past was now a noble in the palace. She was never idle. After walking around for a long time, the great prince, who was standing quietly to the side, finally couldn't take it anymore. He sighed and said, "Mother, what exactly is the matter?" The princes had their own manners outside the palace. Furthermore, the great prince had become the first prince among the princes because of his achievements on the Western expedition. Naturally, he could no longer live in the palace. There were many rules in the royal family. Even if he wanted to enter the palace to visit his mother, the rules in between were a bit complicated. Lady Ning had used some tricks and jumped over many obstacles to directly summon her own son into the palace. However, she had been walking around the tree in a daze the entire time. The great prince knew that his mother must have something important to tell him. Otherwise, she wouldn't have broken the rules in such an eye-catching manner. However, he wondered if it had something to do with the most recent rumor. "Have you heard about Fan Xian's past?" Lady Ning finally stopped. She pulled out a plain handkerchief from her wrist and carelessly wiped the sweat from her forehead. Her expression was solemn. The great prince thought to himself that it was indeed this matter. He respectfully handed a cup of warm tea to her hand and nodded his head in response. "I know about this matter. However, it happened suddenly and there is no proof." Looking at the intentions of father, Empress Dowager, and grandmother, they would definitely not believe these lowly people's rumors. "I also don't believe it." Lady Ning looked at her son and smiled coldly. "You don't believe it? I think everyone in the world is starting to believe it." She suddenly slapped the stone table angrily and said in a hateful voice, "I don't know what's going on with the director this time to suppress this rumor. Does he not know that this will instead make others believe it? What is Fan Xian supposed to do?" "Fan Xian?" She suddenly became distracted. A moment later, she sighed clearly. "So, she has a son. So it is Fan Xian." Of course, the great prince knew who his mother was talking about. It was the mistress of the Yi family, who had once shone brightly in the Qin kingdom and ended tragically. He guessed his mother's meaning and probingly said, "What do you mean?" Lady Ning's eyebrows furrowed. Without anger, she gave off an imposing aura. She sternly said, "We Dongyi people pay particular attention to distinguishing between gratitude and grudges. Fan Xian's past has been exposed. Regardless of whether or not the emperor remembers the Yi family's contributions, the person in the Eastern Palace will certainly not tolerate him. Listen carefully." In front of outsiders, the great prince was a valiant and skilled general and a strong and brave man. In front of Lady Ning, he was like an obedient kitten. Unconsciously, he brought his feet together and stood like a little soldier in front of his mother. In a low voice, he said, "Mother, please instruct me if things don't go well." A glimmer of valiance appeared between Lady Ning's brows. "No matter what method you use, no matter what, you must protect Fan Xian's life." The great prince didn't even think before agreeing. He had never disobeyed his mother's wishes. However, he still had some doubts in his heart. He knew that his mother had played some kind of role in the blood-soaked night in Jingdou. He just didn't understand why his mother would protect Fan Xian so much. She even ordered him to use the soldiers under his command if he was in danger. This was no different from rebellion. "If Director Chun hadn't saved my life, it would have been impossible for me to follow the emperor back from the mountains and rivers in the north," Lady Ning said coldly. Lady Ning spoke coldly of the events of the past. You know about this matter, but even if I returned to the capital alive, what welcomed me was still only an order from the palace. I was a Dongi prisoner of war. At the time, no one knew that I was pregnant with you. If it hadn't been for Lady Ye's words, you and I would have long become two wandering souls. Lady Ning took a deep breath and said, Fan Xian's mother saved both our lives. Back then, when something happened to her, you were still young. I had no power at all. Now it is different. Since you have some power in your hands, you must protect Fan Xian's life. The courtyard was silent. The winter sun shone down sparsely and faintly, shining on this sincere, pure, and unconventional royal mother and son. If father cannot tolerate Fan Xian, the great prince said quietly, although I control the imperial army, I'm afraid I won't be of much use. That's fine. If worst comes to worst, I'll return his life. It's not that scary. You're about to get married. How could I bear to let you take such a risk? Lady Ning stared into his eyes and said, You don't have to consider the emperor's attitude. Just keep an eye on the Eastern Palace. The great prince's heart seemed to move. He immediately thought of a problem. Although he was a straightforward person, he was not stupid. A moment later, he said in shock, If it was only a descendant of the Yi family, father would certainly not be willing to keep Fan Xian. Looking at the movements these few days, there's only one possibility. Lady Ning gave a not-quite-there smile and said, You finally guessed it? I also think so. For the emperor to not pursue the so-called rebellion, and for even the Empress Dowager to remain silent, there is only one explanation. Fan Xian is not only the son of Lady Yi, he is also his own son. In other words, Fan Xian is a prince that no one knows is your brother. The great prince's expression became somewhat ugly. His fists were tightly clenched. He found it difficult to accept this reality. A moment later, he said hesitantly, Is Fan Xian really father's son? What about Minister Fan? If all of this is true, why did father send Fan Xian to Danzhou back then? Lady Ning smiled coldly and said, Back then? Who can be completely clear about what happened back then? Don't forget that Fan Xian's mother was hated to the bone by the two most powerful women in the palace. The great prince blinked. He didn't dare to believe he had heard these words from his mother's mouth. He thought about it for a long time and said, If even mother could guess Fan Xian's true identity, I think it would have long spread outside the palace. If he guessed it, then he guessed it. Lady Ning brushed the dust off her body and said heroically, Perhaps this is what the director wanted to see. Perhaps all of this happened because he was sharing the emperor's worries and difficulties. After all, the emperor probably doesn't know what to do with his son. How would the emperor punish Fan Xian? This was the question that the Jingdo officials and people were most concerned about these days. If the rumors were true, Fan Xian's only way out was to be imprisoned. If the rumors were false, the palace should have used some method, such as rewards or verbal encouragement, to eliminate the effects. The more the rumors spread, the stranger they became. The reaction of the Overwatch Council and the silence of the Fan Manor all seemed to confirm this rumor. Fan Xian was the orphan of the mistress of the Yi family. The problem was the palace still hadn't sent anyone to capture him. This matter had become quite interesting. The emperor maintained his silence, and the palace maintained its silence. People were confused and began to speculate endlessly. The court officials had originally maintained a clever calm. Even the imperial censorate had only carefully submitted a few memorials to the emperor, describing the rumors in the capital. But the emperor had not published them, and the officials could do nothing. This kind of speculation finally reached its peak after a bold but low-intelligence official jumped out and stirred up a storm in the court. This official's name was Mao Yuelyang. He was the Minister of Rights, responsible for reviewing memorials and correcting those who spoke improperly. This muddle-headed official's nature was rough and straightforward, and he yearned for the perfect rule of the saints. He couldn't bear to see anything that would damage the reputation of the court. After the rumors about Fan Xian's past began to circulate in Jingdo, Mao Yuelyang foolishly ignored his colleague's silence and went straight to the court to ask the emperor to issue an edict to reprimand these false rumors and restore Commissioner Fan's clean reputation. In the court, the emperor only said lightly, "The innocent are innocent, and the corrupted are corrupted. It is a good thing for the people. Why should you all get mixed up in it and lose your dignity?" Who would have thought that Mao Yueliang would not let it go? He insisted that the rumors were damaging to Fan Xian's reputation. If the rumors were false, they should be refuted by the court. If the rumors were true, then according to the laws of the Qing kingdom, Fan Xian should be prosecuted for the crimes of concealing the truth from the court, entering the court without permission, and colluding with traitors. Even if these rumors were absurd and untrustworthy, at least for the sake of the court's reputation, the emperor should let the two Fan brothers defend themselves. Furthermore, Sir Fan Jr. was no longer suitable to continue holding the position of commissioner of the Overwatch Council. As for the palace treasury, before these muddle-headed words were finished, the emperor had already left his seat in a rage. He ordered the guards to drag Mao Yueliang out and beat him 20 times. If it were not for the Empress Dowager's plea, this extremely stupid Minister of Rights would have been beaten to death by the emperor. No one knew of the Xinjiang background behind this Minister of Rights, and no one knew that the emperor's final anger came from the Empress Dowager's appearance to protect him. For the emperor, what he was most afraid of was his mother, sister, and sons allying together. In this situation, the ruler of a generation coldly and even forcefully reacted, forcibly preserving Fan Xian's official position and title. This was a kind of stance, the stance of a lion protecting its territory. But the officials and people of the Qing kingdom did not know of the problems in the palace. Once the matter of the beating came out, Jingdo was shocked. Thinking of the last time the imperial censorate had impeached Fan Xian, they had also been cruelly beaten. People once again noticed that the supreme imperial favor Fan Xian had received these years could not even compare to that of the princes. Thinking of the emperor's vague attitude toward this matter, people began to guess. The human imagination was sometimes very poor, but sometimes it was incomparably rich. The rumors about Fan Xian's past began to uncontrollably and gradually slide in a direction that some people did not like to see. As for whether or not the shadowy figure of the old man in the wheelchair was behind these guesses, no one knew. In any case, not long after the first explosive news spread throughout Jingdo, a second explosive news began to spread through the streets and alleys of Jingdo. However, when the common people and officials talked about this news, they seemed even more mysterious, careful, and incomparably excited. May I ask if you know? Sir Fan Jr. is the illegitimate child of the Qing Kingdom's emperor. Of course, he's completely carved from the same mold. You've seen the emperor's dragon countenance. This, I guessed. But honestly speaking, Sir Fan Jr. is a rare talent. He is skilled in both the pen and the sword. His talent in poetry astounds the world. His reputation is known far and wide. Such a person, truly only our wise and divine emperor could have given birth to him. Of course. But, Minister Fan Minister Fan is pitiful. It's also Master Fan's fault for not choosing a good name. In the Li Palace in Xinjiang, the eldest princess gently drew her willowy eyebrows. There was a glimmer of a self-mocking smile at the corners of her lips. This wondrous woman, who had always considered herself to be flawless, finally knew she had made a fatal mistake after these 2 consecutive rumors. Her brother the emperor must have begun to doubt her thoughts. As for that little thing called Fan Xian, Sir Yuan, I did not listen to your opinion. It was wrong. The eldest princess gently pressed her lips together and said lightly, "The strangeness of Sir Fan Jr.'s life is truly unexpected. The first rumor was enough to shock the world. No one thought there would be a second wave. Now, like Huang Yi, Yuan Hongdao had become the chief strategist in Xinjiang. He slowly said, "At the beginning, I advised the princess to temporarily endure because I felt that the news of Fan Xian being a descendant of the Yi family was a bit strange. But I did not expect that this news would be followed by this shocking speculation. Things happened too suddenly, and the situation changed too quickly. We were momentarily at a loss. This is not the fault of war, but the will of heaven." Now that the eldest princess had lost the Chui family, Her interest had suffered irreversible damage. She had truly begun to discover the abilities of her good son-in-law. In her anger, it was difficult for her to maintain her previous arrogant calmness. But her follow-up reaction was a bit too late and even useless. So when the first rumor entered her ears, she did not think twice, and even disregarded Yuan Hongdao's strong opposition. She decided to use this matter to pull Fan Xian off his horse. But communication between Xinyang and the capital was inconvenient. She wanted to use the Empress Dowager's mouth and the seemingly stupid imperial censor of the 6 departments to force the emperor to remove Fan Xian from his position. She did not expect to immediately receive the second news. Fan Xian was the emperor's illegitimate child. Perhaps other people would have needed to guess, but the eldest princess believed it immediately after hearing it. She began to secretly laugh at her own stupidity. How could she not even understand such a simple matter? She had wasted a pawn in court, used a sliver of her mother's affection for her, and most failed of all, touched the emperor's reverse scale. For no reason at all, she had allowed Fan Xian to easily regain his footing. Thinking of this, the self-mockery and regret in her heart were like a poisonous snake gnawing at the heart of the most beautiful woman in the Qing kingdom. Yi Qingmei, her head began to hurt. She muttered to herself as if she was moaning. In this life, will I never be able to match up to you? Even your son can defeat me so easily. Night fell in the capital. Wu Zhu, who had not appeared for a long time, silently appeared in a small alley behind Fan Manor. He was covered with a black cloth. At the end of the alley was a noodle shop. The oil lamp on the noodle shop was as big as a bean, and it shivered in the cold wind. A man wearing ordinary clothes was sitting on a long bench outside the shop. The man on the bench did not have a bowl in front of him. His clothes were thin, and he did not seem to be afraid of the cold. His face was strangely calm, as if he was born without any expression, and his pair of cold and emotionless eyes seemed to be able to see through everything in the world. Tomorrow's chapter is a bit difficult to write. I need to think about it carefully. P.S. Yesterday, I calculated the monthly votes for a long time and found that Qing Yu's year was ranked 10th in the old book. Thinking of the possibility of getting an extra 1,000 yuan, I am very happy. I'm earnestly asking for votes. Please vote for me, but this is all I can do at this speed. To be continued. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 326. Wu Zhu lowered his head slightly, allowing the cold night wind to blow at the black cloth over his eyes. His steady and terrifying right hand slowly gripped the handle of the metal drill at his waist. Step by step, he walked toward the noodle shop. The clothes on a man in the noodle shop were made of coarse cloth. It was earthen yellow, half-sleeved, and not thick. It was the clothing of the laborers on the south side of the capital. There was nothing unusual about it. He blinked. The coldness in his eyes did not change. The expression on his face did not change. He only followed the sound of Wu Zhu's footsteps and slowly stood up from the bench. The plain-clothed man held a knife in his hand, a straight knife. With a wave of his hand, the edge of the knife whistled through the air and slashed horizontally. The straight knife landed on the neck of the old shop owner, who was bending over to pick noodles. With a chi sound, the noodle shop owner's neck sprayed out blood and poured into the pot of noodles without missing a single drop. Immediately after, the noodle shop owner's head made a cracking sound. Like a heavy fruit falling from a tree in autumn, it was separated from the branch and fell into the noodle soup. With a splat, a few streams of hot and bloody soup splashed out. Without warning, without reason, unusually cold-blooded and steady attack, the noodle shop owner's head was separated from his body. The old head floated up and down in the soup. The soup had already been dyed a murky red. Under the light of the oil lamp that could be extinguished at any moment in the winter night, the scene looked unspeakably terrifying and strange. Wu Zhu stood 30 feet in front of the cloth-clothed man. The half of his face that was exposed outside the black cloth did not move. It was as if he did not care at all that the man had just killed an innocent noodle shop owner in front of him. You came from the south. The blind man's voice was always monotonous and lacked any sense of rhythm. The cloth-clothed man slowly put away his straight knife. His cold eyes stared at Wu Zhu. Although his eyes and expression did not reveal any emotion, for some reason, it gave people the feeling that he had entered a state of extreme vigilance. "Routine patrol," the cloth-clothed man said in a weak voice. "I came to find you." Wu Zhu said, "You came to kill Fan Xian." The cloth-clothed man said, "You deliberately spread the news. Because I could not find you in the south, I could only use this method to force you to show yourself." Wu Zhu looked at him coldly, as if he was looking at a dead man. "You know Fan Xian is her descendant, so of course you would come to the capital to kill him." The linen-clothed man's eyebrows twitched strangely, as if he wanted to express a kind of astonishment and incomprehension. However, it was clear that his expression was a little stiff, so it looked a little comical. His eyebrows were wriggling like two little worms. "You knew the reason, so you asked me to come. Why did this plain-clothed man come to Jingdo to kill Fan Xian after knowing he was Yi Qingmei's son?" From the conversation between Wu Zhu and the plain-clothed man, it was clear that the two knew each other. Furthermore, Wu Zhu knew that once the other party found out about Fan Xian's past, he would do anything to enter the capital and kill him. So he waited outside Fan Manor. It seemed that the recent turmoil in the capital was perhaps the result of Wu Zhu pretending to have miscalculated, secretly reminding Ku He so that he could uncover Fan Xian's past from the distant northern Qi without leaving a trace. If the blind uncle had the ability to construct such a perfect plan, then the only reason he did all of this was to attract the plain-clothed man to the capital. Who was this man in plain clothes? A few months ago, on the southern coastline of the kingdom of Qing, a nameless man appeared. He searched everywhere for a blind man, and when he did not receive an answer to his question, he would simply kill everyone who had seen him. There was no reason, and he did not ask for the reason. He was the southern serial killer that Fan Xian and Yin Bingyun could not forget. When the Ministry of Justice was at their wits' end, the Overwatch Council finally began to investigate these strange and bizarre murder cases. But every time the aces of the Overwatch Council tracked down this nameless man, he would turn around and mercilessly kill them all. So until now, no one knew what this nameless man looked like. Yin Bingyun had once thought of borrowing soldiers from Fan Xian and using the Tiger Guards to go south because of this man. When he first appeared in this world, it seemed that he was not used to the ways and principles of this world. That was why he needlessly killed so many people. It was not until later that he gradually understood more things. So he tied his messy hair into the most common bun, put his bare feet into the necessary straw sandals, chose a straight knife that was commonly used by the warriors of the kingdom of Qing, and at the same time, changed into the least noticeable coarse cloth clothes. Wu Zhu took a step forward, getting closer to the noodle stall. He lowered his head slightly and said, "I went south to look for you, but I did not find you." The cloth-clothed man said something that was difficult to understand. "I looked for you in the south, but I did not find you." Wu Zhu's feet were bare, while the cloth-clothed man wore straw sandals. Wu Zhu's hair was tightly bound behind his head, and he did not move. The cloth-clothed man's hair was tied into a bun slightly higher. The aura on the two of them was very similar. Although their clothes and appearances were different, it seemed that these were the only two things that could distinguish the two of them. The aura emanating from their bodies made it clear that these two were ruthless killing machines, but they were also like two hunters hiding in the night. They were clearly looking for each other, but they cared about who found the other first. They demanded that they be the first to find the other party and not let the other party find them. Although it seemed like there was no difference, it was like a life and death struggle between a hunter and a wounded tiger. Whoever had the upper hand would be able to continue living in this world. "Someone told you that I was in the south," Wu Zhu said. The cloth-clothed man did not answer his question. He said directly, "You cannot leave any traces." Wu Zhu said, "She has already left too many traces. Go back to the temple, and I will not kill you." The cloth-clothed man seemed to find Wu Zhu's words very difficult to understand, and it greatly conflicted with the principles he had always believed in. A strange expression flashed through his cold and bright eyes, an expression that was rarely seen in the eyes of the common people. "Come back with me." The cloth-clothed man's tone was still as flat as ever. Wu Zhu's voice was a bit more angry than the other person's. "I forgot some things. Wait for me to remember." The conversation between the two of them continued with a very strange rhythm. If one paid close attention, one would find that in this continuous conversation, the two of them did not use a single question. Instead, they used a very certain tone to describe something. Perhaps they were both very confident in their ability to make logical judgments. Perhaps only these two strange people could use such leaps of thought to carry out a conversation that was unusually difficult for ordinary people to understand. The two people's lips suddenly moved, but no sound came out. It was as if they were carrying out a final, silent negotiation. The negotiation broke down. Wu Zhu took another step toward the noodle stall. The distance between the two of them had already changed from 30 feet to 20 feet. The cloth-clothed man's face was expressionless. He did not take a single step back. He only stared at Wu Zhu's hand on the metal drill, as if waiting for that pale hand to blossom. The sound of a lower pitch came from the stove with the noodle pot. The noodle soup with the human head carried a thick, bloody foam over the top of the pot and flowed along the edge of the pot into the stove. When it came into contact with the fiery red pieces of charcoal, there was a popping sound and a pungent smell of smoke rose into the air. Wu Zhu moved. The black cloth over his eyes became a black thread in an instant. The metal drill in his hand did not blossom, but like the sharp tip of a winter bamboo, it pierced straight toward the cloth-clothed man's chest. Strangely, Wu Zhu did not choose to pierce the throat with the drill today. Almost at the same time he moved, the cloth-clothed man with the straight knife also moved. The two of them used the same reaction time and speed to rush forward. No one could detect the slightest difference. The distance of 20 feet disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. Wu Zhu and the cloth-clothed man suddenly collided. The speed of the two of them was so fast that it exceeded the limits of what the human eye could see. It was as if in one moment they were standing 20 feet apart, and in the next they were standing face to face. Like two streams of light, they suddenly met. With such speed, whether it was Fan Xian before he was injured, or the shadow assassin of the 6th Bureau, or even Haitang, none of them would be able to react in time. They could only wait helplessly for death. Other than the 4 great grandmasters, no one else in the world had ever touched such a realm. However, when the streams of light collided, there was no dazzling fireworks. In the blink of an eye, there was a deathly silence. The tip of a knife protruded from Wu Zhu's right rib, awe-inspiring and terrifying. Something was dripping from the knife onto the ground. A metal drill accurately pierced through the middle of the cloth-clothed man's abdomen. There was not a single deviation. Wu Zhu moved first, and his speed seemed to be slightly faster than his enemies. So when the two of them collided, his left knee still had room to crouch. It was just a little faster, but it was a fatal little. At this moment, he maintained this half-crouching position. The metal drill in his hand rose slightly, and like raising fire to burn the heavens, it pierced the opponent's abdomen. From the garden behind the alley came the faint sounds of people. The sound was very soft, but it fell into the ears of Wu Zhu and the cloth-clothed man. Like a saw cutting through wood, the two of them separated in silence. The weapons in their hands were slowly pulled out from each other's body. At this moment, a gurgling sound came from the cloth-clothed man's abdomen, as if something had been broken. Even with such a heavy injury, the cloth-clothed man's face remained expressionless, as if he did not feel the slightest pain. He only stared at the wound in his abdomen like a baby, as if wondering why he was a little slower than Wu Zhu. Wu Zhu had defeated his enemy with one move, but he was also heavily injured. However, he was still as expressionless as his opponent. Only the corner of his lips, which was not covered by the black cloth, had a more worldly air of alienation. He knew that his opponent could no longer survive in this world. And the reason he was able to be a little faster than his opponent was because he had used Fan Xian's past to lure his opponent here. So he had made more preparations. He did not wear shoes, nor did he tie up his hair. Do not be tainted by the world of mortals. The words of the temple did have some truth. The night snow began to fall again. A few figures suddenly leaped over the garden wall and landed noiselessly in the alleyway. As soon as they landed, they pulled out the long knives on their backs and formed into a killing formation, looking around cautiously. The newcomers were the tiger guards responsible for Fan Xian's safety. After confirming that it was safe, Gauda sheathed his knife and walked to the noodle stall through the sparse snowflakes. Looking at the pot of noodle soup on top of the broken stove and the sinister and terrifying head in the soup, he furrowed his brows. Immediately after, his gaze fell on the place where the head and body had been cut off. He only glanced at the wound, and a glimmer of coldness and fear involuntarily appeared in his eyes. What a fast knife! Gauda suddenly felt an icy coldness at his neck, as if snowflakes had burrowed into his clothes. He knew that the battle that had happened here earlier was not something someone like him could rashly interfere with. Although he had not seen it with his own eyes, he could guess what kind of miraculous realm the two people fighting had. The snow gradually grew heavier and gradually grew colder. The still warm noodle soup and blood also chilled the hearts of everyone in the alley. The noodle stall paused miserably at the mouth of the alley. The owner was already dead, the stove was already cold, and the blood was already dry. No one in this world had ever seen that in this snowy night alley there had once been two nameless aces, not ranked among the grandmasters, but with the strength of a grandmaster, who had fought here. The Overwatch Council official on night duty was dozing off. The building in the snowy night appeared even colder and more solemn. Suddenly, a gust of wind swept past and startled him awake. He slapped his face in shock and ordered himself to wake up. There were usually many officials on duty in the courtyard at night. Furthermore, Director Chun had not returned to Chin Garden recently because of Commissioner Fan's matter. Instead, he sat directly in the courtyard and suppressed everything. If the director knew that he had fallen asleep earlier, there would be no good consequences. At this time, Chun Pingping was half leaning on the wheelchair, dozing off. The old man's health had not been very good these past few years. Even though the stove in the room was extremely hot, he still subconsciously used his skinny hands to pull the wool blanket on his knees and cover his chest. The door opened and was closed again. Chun Pingping woke up and slowly blinked his somewhat muddy and powerless eyes. Looking at the black cloth in front of him, he quietly said, "Why are you here?" Only then did he notice the terrifying wound on the left side of Wu Zhu's chest. His snow-white eyebrows immediately rose. Although he was not angry, he was very cautious. He asked what happened. Who could injure Wu Zhu? Then it could only be one of the great grandmasters who had acted. No matter how arrogant Chun Pingping was, in the current troublesome situation in Jingdo, it was difficult for him to accept the news that the enemy had suddenly gained the help of a great grandmaster. Wu Zhu did not answer his question. He only directly said 3 sentences. "Have the shadow return. The person who injured me knows that I am in the south. If Fan Xian dies, the Qin kingdom will fall." Wu Zhu knew that the old cripple in front of him had enough intelligence to understand these 3 sentences. The terrifying injury he had received made it impossible for him to hold out much longer. After he finished speaking, he quickly and quietly left the Overwatch Council. Chun Pingping sat in his wheelchair and sank into a long silence. In the fireplace not far from him, the red firelight danced like a fairy, reflecting red on his pale and haggard face. Although Wu Zhu's 3 sentences were simple, they revealed very important information. The first sentence was to have the shadow return, indicating that his injury was very serious and that he could not stay by Fan Xian's side to protect him. He wanted Chun Pingping to fulfill his promise ahead of time and summon the shadow back to protect Fan Xian's safety. However, the person who had the power to injure Wu Zhu should already be dead. Otherwise, given Wu Zhu's personality, for the sake of Fan Xian's life, no matter how serious his injury was, he would not leave Jingdo. Who could injure Wu Zhu? It could not be one of the great grandmasters. Otherwise, Wu Zhu would not purposely hide the other person's identity. Chun Pingping's heart trembled slightly. He vaguely guessed something. This conjecture had existed many years ago, but it had never been confirmed. On the night Wu Zhu carried Fan Xian out of Jingdou, the two of them had thought about how to help Fan Xian escape from that unknown danger. But how did the temple know that Wu Zhu was in the south? Chen Pingping furrowed his brows and began to sort through everything. During the 2 years that Fan Xian had been in the capital, Chen Pingping had asked more than once about Wu Zhu's whereabouts. Fan Xian had always carefully told a lie, saying that Wu Zhu was in the south looking for Yi Luyan to play. Other than Chen Pingping, the only person who knew of this false information was the emperor, whom Chen Pingping had once told. See Volume 2, Chapter 62. Wu Zhu's second sentence was to remind Chen Pingping of this point. Looking at it this way, the threat in the third sentence was something that should be expected. Your Majesty. The wrinkles at the corner of Chen Pingping's eyes twitched slightly. He sighed softly. You really do surprise me. I admire you. In just a moment, he had already figured out the emperor's true thoughts. Although he did not know how the emperor could form a connection with the illusory temple, he was very sure of one thing. The great emperor really did want Wu Zhu to disappear. For an emperor, perhaps it was very difficult for him to accept that there was a great grandmaster by his side. If a great grandmaster went crazy, he would have enough power to shake the rule of the court. This was something that anyone could think of. Even if it was impossible for him to kill his way into the royal palace alone and slaughter the entire royal family, he could travel to the ends of the world with a single sword and kill off all the provincial officials in the roads without having to worry about being surrounded by the army. He could also hide in Jingdou for 10 years. Once he drew his sword, he would scare the emperor so much that he would never leave the palace, and his edict could not leave the city. Under such circumstances, no one dared to be an official. The emperor did not dare show his face, and other than falling apart, what else could the court do? That was why he was able to intimidate all the nobles and officials in the north who wanted to rebel. That was why Sigurd could protect Dongyi with a single sword for so many years and allow the power of his sword to spread out and support the small vassal states caught between the two large countries. As long as the seemingly undisciplined but actually intelligent Yi Luyan continued his endless journey to the ends of the world, the Qin kingdom would treat the Yi family generously. Even if an emperor wanted to change the defenses of Jingdou, he would be forced to use such a shameful and sinister move as arson. Of course, Yi Luyan himself knew the taboo of the royal family. After all these years, he had never returned to Jingdou. If war broke out, the emperor could use the Yi family to threaten Yi Luyan. He could use the lives of tens of thousands of northern Qi people to persuade He. He could use the survival of Dongyi to remind Sigurd. The two sides could reach some kind of balanced agreement. Wu Zhu was different from these three great grandmasters. He did not have a large family to burden him. He did not have any country or people that he needed to protect. Everything he did was for Fan Xian alone. Thus, he had more freedom and could not be threatened by the emperor or used by each other. The two sides did not even have room to bargain. If something happened to Fan Xian, once Wu Zhu went crazy, the world would go crazy with him. Thus, as long as Wu Zhu was there, the emperor had to cherish Fan Xian. Just like in the past few years, he had to play the role of a guilty and helpless father, an emperor with great ambition but a belly full of sorrow. Perhaps the emperor admired Fan Xian as a son from the depths of his heart, but in the end, he was still an emperor. He could not allow Fan Xian to have such a loyal and devoted great-grandmaster as a servant. Even if he had not used the people from the temple to come this time, there would come a day when the emperor would find a way to get rid of Wu Zhu. Of course, Chen Pingping knew that this was only one reason. As for the other reason, it was probably the faint fear in the emperor's heart. The temple never interfered in worldly affairs. No one had ever truly seen the people from the temple. The people from the temple did not appear in the world once in hundreds of years. If they could have Wu Zhu die with the people from the temple and forever hide Fan Xian's connection to the Yi family, burying everything in the past in a pile of old papers for the emperor, this was perhaps the most beautiful ending. However, the emperor had not thought that Fan Xian's past as a descendant of the Yi family would be exposed so quickly. His own son had become the temple's primary target. He wanted to use the temple as a knife to kill Wu Zhu. Instead, Wu Zhu had used Fan Xian's past to successfully lure and kill the visitor from the temple and protect Fan Xian's life. Chun Pingping did not know what Wu Zhu had done, but he only thought with a glimmer of sorrow that the emperor clearly knew that someone from the temple had come to the world. After Fan Xian's past was exposed, he had never warned him or Fan Xian. Could it be that, for anyone other than himself, the emperor would only give faint sorrow and sympathy? The old man smiled coldly and pushed the wheelchair in front of the fireplace. He greedily extended his hand closer. As he warmed himself, he yawned and mumbled in an unclear voice, "You really know how to enjoy yourself. You actually made a fireplace. You are excellent in everything. It is just that you are a bit muddle-headed in this matter." Girl. At dawn, the remote and quiet place in Jingdo called 3 Li Wai was dark. One could faintly make out the shadow of a circular building. It was made entirely of black wood. It was a temple. Snowflakes fell one after another, causing the temple to be covered with a layer of otherworldly aura. This was the Temple of Qing. It was rumored that the only place in the kingdom of Qing that could communicate with the illusory temple of the Temple of Qing, the temple where the royal family worshipped heaven. The temple door opened with a creak. The great priest of the Temple of Qing, who had not appeared in Jingdo for a long time, walked out. Compared to Ku He of the Temple of Qi, this ascetic monk, who was unknown, had a shocked expression on his face. Silently and sorrowfully, he picked up the body from the snow and staggered into the temple. The body was wearing a common cloth garment. The cloth-clothed man did not answer his question. He said directly, "We cannot leave any traces." Wu Zhu said, "She has already left too many traces. Go back to the temple. I won't kill you." When I wrote this, I almost had Wu Zhu say, "Anyone who walks by must leave a trace." Then I immediately came to my senses. I was stunned and speechless. Only now did I realize that I really was a very sour person. This was a very scary thing. Today's chapter was very tiring. The quality was better than the previous chapters. From the next chapter onwards, it will be much easier. The consequences of yesterday's vote solicitation were shocking. Suddenly, it went up. I don't know what to say. I can only sincerely thank everyone. Then I thought of the big mistake I made with Purple Eye in the book review section. I am so sorry. I wish the mother and child safe. I wish Sister Kofi a happy pregnancy. Don't crawl with laughter. I wish everyone an easy life. To be continued. If you want to know what happens next, please go to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 327. The Fan Manor was now divided into a front and back manor, occupying a large area in the south of the city. Between the two manors was a garden with fake mountains and flowing water. Naturally, the garden was not small. It was winter, and the trees had long hardened. Only a few frozen plum blossoms were still growing. Early that morning, there was a sudden rush of breathing in the Fan Manor garden. Ha 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 ha. Fan Xian was wearing an unlined robe and was running around the garden wall. He had just recovered from his injury and was in a rush to train his body. Inevitably, it was a little strenuous, and he was panting heavily. The 2 tiger guards on duty and a few swordsmen of the 6th Bureau were vigilantly guarding every corner of the garden, ensuring the safety of the commissioner's morning training. Outside the study, Deng Ziyu and Gao had strange expressions on their faces. Their gazes followed Fan Xian. They did not understand why Fan Xian ran for so long every morning, and Fan Xian had never explained it. Training twice a day was a good habit he had developed since he was very young. Now that he was injured and could not train his Jinqi, he could only put in more effort in training his body. Fit and hard work was one of Fan Xian's best qualities. However, none of the servants in the backyard looked at the young master who was running. These days, everyone was used to it. They squatted in front of the stone steps of the servants' room, brushing their teeth and chatting with each other while blowing foam. These were the best things in the palace treasury, and only the back manor of the fan manor would be willing to buy them for the servants. Fan was a person with a slight obsession with mental cleanliness. The 10 laps were finally over. Fan stood under the eaves outside the study, panting heavily. His hands were on his hips, and his head was lowered. He looked just like Yao Ming in the fourth quarter. He waved his hand, signaling for the servant girl who was holding the copper basin to wait a moment. His family's women were still in the Tsang Mountains, so the former residents had sent a maid to serve him. The maid, who had 2 braided braids, curiously looked at the sweaty face of the young master. She felt very strange at her heart. Why did a character like the young master have to make himself suffer like this? She put the copper basin on the bench and covered Fan with a coat. She flicked the water with her little finger to test the temperature of the water. "Young master," she said quietly, "the water is very hot. It will get cold if we wait any longer." Fan nodded and reached into the copper basin to pick up the towel. He didn't care at all about the scalding water and didn't wring it much. He lowered his body and placed the towel on his face, wiping vigorously. Water droplets dripped down from the towel and his cheeks. After washing his face was slightly red from the heat, and he seemed to be in much better spirits. His eyes were clear and full of spirit. He threw the towel back into the basin and looked at the 2 people beside him. After thinking for a moment, he said, "We are going to enter the palace today. Ziwe, go to the first bureau and see if there are any council matters that have been suppressed these few days." Deng Zi responded and left. Fan glanced at Gaudo again and said, "Wait for me outside for a while. I have something to discuss with you in a bit." After the situation in the capital had settled, Fan knew that the palace did not intend to destroy him physically. He no longer had any reservations and summoned 4 tiger guards to come down from the Tsang Mountains. Gaudo was not on duty today, so he was a bit confused when Fan called for him. Hearing Fan say this, he felt a bit more at ease and stayed outside the study. Entering the quiet study, the light in Fan eyes dimmed a bit. He sat down on a chair and carefully examined the condition of his body. He found that the condition of his body after the explosion of Jinshi last time had not changed much. His meridians were still riddled with holes, and the Jinshi scattered among his internal organs was temporarily well-behaved and had not harmed the functions of his internal organs. Under these circumstances, he did not dare to forcibly circulate his Jinshi. But if he waited for his meridians to automatically recover, who knew how long that would take? After returning from the Tsang Mountains, Fan had been very quiet. He did not participate in the discussions and struggles of the outside world. In the eyes of Chun Pingping, Fan Jian, and Fei Jie, the older generation, perhaps the young man had been frightened by the successive shocks. Furthermore, that level of political struggle was indeed not something Fan could control, so they tacitly approved of his silence. But only Fan himself knew that the biggest reason he appeared so relaxed these days and allowed his elders to arrange things for him was because of the condition of his body. Uncle Wu Zhu had once said that there was no one in this world that could truly be trusted. So Fan only trusted himself. In his eyes, no one's favor, no one's care, was as reassuring as his own strength. Even if he had the Tiger Guards, the Overwatch Council, and the Chinian unit at his side, if things really did not go well, the only thing he could rely on was his own martial arts. The problem was, his Jinshi had completely dissipated and he had no ability to protect himself. Although the people outside all thought his injuries were gradually healing, he knew that was far from the case. Thus, he had to be silent. He had to shrink into his shell like a turtle. Although his posture was ugly, it was safer. A knock came from outside the study. Fan made a sound of acknowledgement. The person who pushed open the door was the wife of the Tung family. She held a tray in her hand. On her were 2 bowls of medicinal soup and a few small bowls of medicinal pills. It gave off a strong smell of herbs. Fan medicine was watched and handled daily by the wife of the Tung family. In such an important process, there were not many people he could completely trust. The wife of the Tung family placed the tray on the table and quickly went to pour a few cups of warm tea. Like soldiers lining up, She was terrified that she wouldn't have time to pour water while Fan Xian swallowed the medicine. Fan Xian shook his head, with one hand holding the medicinal bowl and the other grabbing a handful of medicinal pills. He sent them into his mouth without a change in expression. However, the amount of medicine was too much. Even with his bold and vigorous eating method, it still took a while to clear all of the medicine on the tray. "It's been hard on you, young master." The wife of the Tang family wore a pitiful expression and smacked her lips as if she was the one taking the medicine. Other than pity, this woman also greatly admired the young master. Every day, he gulped down so much medicine. What kind of life was this? Yet, the young master's expression did not change, and he enjoyed it as if it were malt syrup. Sir Fei of the Overwatch Council was also something. It was just a knife wound. Was there a need to be so nervous and prescribe so much medicine? Fan Xian smiled and said, "I saved money for breakfast." The master and servant chatted for a bit before the wife of the Tang family left the study. Fan Xian sat behind the desk and began to stare blankly. Every day, he ate 1 or 2 caddies of medicine. There was no need to mention his teacher's medical skills. It was indeed very beneficial for strengthening meridians and channels. However, in the end, it was not a complete solution. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but think of Haitang's letter. Was Ku He really willing to pass on the martial method of Tianyi Dao to him? He smiled self-mockingly. It looked like the other party was preparing to raise him like a fierce tiger. The Qing kingdom had done this before, such as the eldest princess and himself. They all hoped that Shang Shanhu in the north could continue to maintain his bravery and fierceness so that the other party's court would always be in a nervous and uneasy state. Ku He would not be careless in such an important matter as the martial method of Tianyi Dao being passed on to outsiders. Furthermore, only Haidang had a good relationship with him among the disciples of Tianyi Dao. Fan Xian was certain that the person who would pass on the martial method to the south would be Haidang. Thinking of this, for some reason, Fan Xian began to look forward to that day. Suddenly, he lowered his gaze and looked at the cups of tea in front of him. He felt that these cups of deep green and yellow tea were very much like one-eyed strange people. After a moment of surprise, he laughed out loud because of his strange ability to make connections. Immediately after, his throat felt dry, his stomach swelled, and the urge to vomit rose up. Knowing that he had taken too much medicine and taken it too quickly, he quickly picked up a cup of tea and downed it. He rubbed his chest with lingering fear and smiled bitterly. He no longer looked as cool and fierce as he did in front of the wife of the Tang family. For some reason, after being tormented like this, his mood strangely improved. He tossed his past, hatred, threats, the royal palace, Jiangnan, and everything else to the back of his mind. Life was like countless medicinal pills. You had to swallow them slowly. Perhaps it would be bitter, perhaps it would choke, but you still had to eat them. It was always good to be a bit happier. Gauda held his knife behind him with one hand. His feet stood at an irregular angle. His aura was imposing, but no one saw that the hand holding the hilt of a long knife behind him was trembling slightly. He looked at Fan Xian, who was beaming with joy not far in front of him. His heart skipped a beat. He wondered to himself why the commissioner was so happy today. It was completely unlike the mildewed state of a few days ago. After Fan Xian left the study, only then did Gauda know that the commissioner had asked him to wake up early to exchange pointers with him. Gauda knew that he was not a match for Fan Xian. Furthermore, Fan Xian had recently been heavily injured, so he would not agree. However, he was forced by Fan Xian. In the end, the two of them decided not to use Jinqi to compete. This was exactly what Fan Xian wanted. He didn't have any Jinqi left, so he couldn't really fight. The Tiger Guard's long knife matched up against the black dagger the palace guards had picked up from the golden chrysanthemum bushes in front of the hanging temple. The two aces were fighting in the garden of the Fan Manor with real weapons. The clanging and clanging was very lively. It attracted many servants to come and watch the show. Some of the bolder ones even shouted at the top of their lungs to cheer for the young master. Unable to use Jinqi, he relied entirely on his body's control and reaction speed. In just a moment, Gauda was at a disadvantage. No technique seemed to be of much use in front of Fan Xian's reaction speed and reaction speed. There was no Jinqi attached to the weapon. Gao suddenly discovered that Fan Xian's strength was slightly greater than his. Regarding this problem, he could not understand it no matter how he thought about it. He knew how hard he trained in martial arts. How could the commissioner be above him? Particularly now that he was facing Fan Xian, he was not only facing a superior subordinate. Whenever he thought of Fan Xian's rumored past, Gao would always feel an unconscious fear when he attacked. As a result, one weakened and the other strengthened. After crossing sword a number of times, the hand holding the long knife began to tremble. Fan Xian's finger pulled. The slender black dagger cleverly spun a circle in his hand, drawing a circle of black light. It looked very strange. In reality, this was just a technique he had practiced in class in his previous life before he was admitted to the hospital. However, in Gao Da's eyes, this move was truly powerful. He looked at Gao Da, furrowed his brows, and shook his head. You can also see that my injury has healed. Don't hold back. After saying this, the tip of his foot pushed off the slightly slippery winter mud. His entire body tilted forward and charged forward quickly. A cold light flashed through Gao Da's eyes. Finally, his two hands gripped the hilt of the long knife. His legs crouched slightly, and he roared, "Break!" The long knife chopped down squarely and sliced through the morning air in the back courtyard of the Fan Manor. The knife came down quickly, but Fan Xian's attack was even faster. While Gao Da's long knife was still raised above his head, he had already charged in front of him. With a spring of his legs and a pull of his wrist, like a bird with food, he held the dagger and stabbed down viciously. With a crisp clang, the two of them separated by 2 steps. They trembled a few times before standing firm. Fan Xian had the upper hand and made it impossible for Gao Da's long knife to fully exert force. Gao Da had the advantage of the weight of the long knife. The two of them fought to a draw. Fan Xian smiled and waved his hand. Let's leave it at that for today. Starting tomorrow, we'll fight every day. I think this is good for healing. After saying this, he coughed and used his sleeve to cover his mouth. Looking at the threads of blood on his sleeve, he did not panic. Although he had not used much Jinqi in that last attack, the blood had rushed back. Without Jinqi to protect his heart meridians, he had still suffered some injuries. Gao did not notice this. He only furrowed his brows and said, "Sir, it's best not to use Jinqi after you're injured. However, replacing training with battle and not using Jinqi doesn't seem to be of much use. After all, when facing an enemy, the difference is too great. Even if you train your body to the extreme, it will not bring much benefit to your realm." As the commander of the Tiger Guards, and seeing Fan Xian running, he mistakenly thought that Fan Xian was planning to walk a new path of cultivation, from external martial arts to internal martial arts. As a matter of course, he reported to his subordinate and cautiously expressed his opposition to this crooked path. Fan Xian smiled. "It's just loosening the meridians. Of course, I know what the foundation is. You don't have to worry." There was something he didn't say. In this world, there were indeed people who did not know Jinqi, but could still reach the highest realm, such as Uncle Wu Zhu. Gao had already reported to him about the murder in the alley outside the manor the night before. He thought that Uncle Wu Zhu had killed another Xinjiang assassin and did not care much. He only thought that one day he would find a secluded manor and have Uncle Wu Zhu cut a few plates of cold shredded radish. He would drink a few cups of wine and reminisce about the happy times he had in Danzhou. The red sun had risen, and the morning chill had slightly dissipated. The servant girl in the front manor had already come to call for him. Fan Xian went into the room to change and walked toward the front manor. Along the way, he looked at the rising sun and the light winter scenery in the garden. His heart was relaxed and at ease. He had no idea that his closest Uncle Wu Zhu had already floated far away to recover from his injuries or what kind of danger he had faced. Fortunately, it was all in the past. The atmosphere at breakfast in Fan Manor was a bit strange. After all, the people in the front manor did not serve Fan Xian every day, so the pretty little servant girls always liked to greedily peek at the young master's beauty. In any case, The young master was used to people looking at him and did not care about it. But today, not many servant girls dared to look at Fan Xian, who had just entered the door. They only stood silently behind the table and served him. Occasionally, one of them dared to glance at him, but the expression in their eyes was one of respect and fear. The imperial power was like the heavens. This idea had long been deeply rooted in the hearts of the common people and scholars. And now, there were rumors that Fan Xian was the illegitimate child of the emperor and the mistress of the Yi family. Thus, everyone looked at Fan Xian differently. The blood of the imperial family ran in his veins. He was no longer just the loving and respectable young master of the past. He was no longer just a powerful official who excelled in both the pen and the sword. He was the son of the emperor. But in this rumor, the role of the master of Fan Manor, Minister of Revenue Fan Jian, was inevitably somewhat awkward. So no matter how curious the servants and servant girls of Fan Manor were, they could not show it at the table unless they wanted to die. They could only whisper to each other in the middle of the night under the warm blankets. Fan Xian could sense that something was amiss, but the beautiful smile on his face did not fade. He walked straight to the table and respectfully bowed to his father, who was sitting upright on it, to pay his respects. Fan Jian half closed his eyes to rest and very naturally nodded his head. Lu Shi, who was sitting next to Fan Jian, had a strange expression on her face. She forced herself to hide it, but the smile on her face was still a bit unnatural. Lu Shi's family background was deep, and, of course, she knew the truth of the rumor. These days, she had long been shocked, especially when she thought about how she had wanted to poison the young man in front of her. Thinking of Fan Xian's true identity, she felt that it was very inappropriate for her to accept this vow. She wanted to stand up and avoid it, but she was afraid that the master would be angry. As if sensing her strangeness, Fan Jian's lips curled into a faint, mocking smile. He slowly opened his eyes, looked at his son in front of him, and said, "You are entering the palace today. Pay attention to your actions." Fan Xian laughed. "It's not the first time, so there's nothing to pay attention to. Isn't it the same as before? Wasn't it the same as before?" The meaning of this sentence was simple, but also not simple. Lu Shi, who was listening on the side, felt her heart tremble. While she was still pondering this, the father and son were already smiling at each other. They understood each other very well. One was comforted by the old, and the other was full of admiration. How harmonious! As they were eating, they suddenly heard the faint sound of people coming from the east gate of the garden. Fan Jian stopped eating and frowned. Who was making a racket? Fan Xian handed over a towel and let Lu Shi wipe the grains of porridge from his father's beard. He knew that ever since his father left his life in Lu Jing River, he had walked the path of righteousness. Seeing his father's slightly angry appearance, he couldn't help but laugh. What could possibly happen? Eat your meal in peace. A servant hurried to the door of the manor to say something, and a servant girl came in to say something. Fan Anji was shocked to hear this. He no longer cared about persuading his father to eat in peace. He put down his chopsticks and stared at the door, not knowing what to say. The mistress, Lin Wan'er, and the mistress, Fan Ruo, had already led Cici and Siki, the two servant girls, and a group of attendants back to the capital in a carriage. They had already arrived at the gate of the manor. Fan Xian looked at his father in surprise. "Father, didn't we hide this from the mountain?" Wan'er and Ruo's group had hurried back to the capital in the early morning. Presumably, they had moved yesterday and had come back overnight. They were in such a hurry that even the Tiger Guards and Overwatch Council officials left on the mountain hadn't had time to send a message to him. This was because the girls had finally learned of the rumors circulating in the capital. They were worried about Fan Xian, so of course they had rushed back. Fan Jian knew that his daughter-in-law and daughter had returned home, and his expression had already returned to normal. He took the towel from Lu Shi and wiped his face, then lowered his head to eat his porridge. He spoke slowly. "Yi Ling'er and Princess Rugia are both on the mountain. How long can this be hidden?" Seeing his son's blank expression, Fan Jian smiled. "Young people have things to say. Go to the back of the manor. In a bit, the little kitchen will make you some new food. Coming down from the cold mountain, make something hot. Fan Xian knew that his father had given him permission, so he hurriedly complied and went out to receive them. The back of the manor was silent. Fan Xian, Wan Er, and Ro sat in the room like three clay bodhisattvas. It seemed that they didn't know who should speak. After all, this matter was a bit complicated. If Fan Xian were to explain, he would probably have to say a long story. If he were to let the girls ask, they didn't know what the rumors were about. Asking random questions would make Fan Xian unhappy. A moment later, it was Wan Er who finally bit her lower lip and probingly asked, "Have the rumors in the capital died down?" "No." Hearing his wife's question, Fan Xian actually let out a big breath in his heart. He smiled and replied, "How can things like rumors die down so quickly? And you too. How big of a deal is this? Is it worth rushing down the mountain and traveling through the night? What if you too fall? How am I supposed to live?" He was now teaching his wife and sister a lesson, but he had forgotten that when he first came down the mountain, he was like a frightened stray dog. He had been ridiculed by Fan Jian and Chun Pingping. "I'm going into the palace in a bit." Fan Xian thought for a bit and looked at his sister, who wanted to say something but stopped herself, and his wife, whose face was full of helplessness. He smiled slightly and said, "If there is anything, we can talk about it when we get back tonight, but I want to say something first. Fan Xian, will always be Fan Xian. I can give you this promise." Fan Xian went out and began to prepare for the palace. Cici, with a face full of exhaustion, moved in front of him. Cici had grown up with Fan Xian. Their affection did not need to be said. More importantly, she had been influenced by Fan Xian to become very bold. There were no taboos or too many thoughts of seniority. Lin Wanner and Ruo both had some questions that they couldn't ask, but this serving girl was more direct. She mysteriously pulled Fan Xian's sleeve and came to a quiet place in the garden. She opened her mouth and asked, "Young master, I heard from Lady Yi that your mother is the mistress of the Yi family?" Fan Xian laughed loudly and patted Cici's head. Cici is still the most straightforward. Then, he lowered his voice and also mysteriously replied, "Yes." Cici's mouth opened wide and immediately turned into a silly smile. This serving girl was older than Fan Xian by 2 years, but she still had such a soft and dazed personality. She was still not satisfied with her gossipy heart and continued to ask, "Then, are you really the Emperor's son?" To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 328. Fan Xian smiled and looked at Cici until she felt uncomfortable. Only then did he retract his smile and say seriously, "You'll have to ask my mother about this." Xiao Jinyu, serious reminder. The above sentence has nothing to do with the main text. It was purely because Xiao Jin's book review made me laugh so hard that I felt it had to be the headline. The main text is below. A carriage rolled over the green stone pavement of Zinjiku, making a squeaking sound. The winter was deep and cold, and the road was already covered in ice. The four-wheeled carriage didn't dare go too fast. The driver, Su Wen Mao, was carefully and gently waving his whip. Around him, the swordsman of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council, wearing boots, followed the carriage forward and looked around cautiously. The members of the Chinian unit were scattered. They were disguised as common people in cotton-padded jackets and hidden in the crowd of onlookers on the street. On the carriage was the emblem of the Fan family. It was square and round, with flowing gold and black borders. Fan Xian and Gauda sat in the carriage. 2 tiger guards sat across from them. Fan Xian's expression was calm. He said, "The arrangement is too big and too conspicuous." Gauda lifted a corner of the thick curtain from the carriage window and glanced at the street. He said calmly, "Assassins suddenly came from the mountains. Who knows if the capital is safe or not? The Emperor is very angry about this and has ordered me to ensure your safety." His gaze swept across the street. There were not many people on the street, but the people in the houses and shops had already noticed the Fan family's carriage. They also guessed who was sitting in the carriage. They all cast strange gazes toward the carriage. The rumor had already spread for many days. The news that Fan Xian was the emperor's illegitimate child had already been deeply rooted in the hearts of the people. Looking at the direction the carriage was heading, the Jingdo people knew that Sir Fan Jr. was going to enter the palace. They couldn't help guessing. They didn't know whether or not Jingdo would provide them with even more shocking news. The royal palace seemed very close. The carriage came to a stop outside the square in front of the palace. After the Hanging Temple incident, the Imperial Army's defenses were much tighter. Fan Xian got out of the carriage and accepted the large robe Su Wenmao handed him. He also took a walking stick and put it under his arm. Gauden knew that Fan Xian's external injuries had long healed. He couldn't help looking at him with surprise. Fan Xian didn't pay attention to his gaze. He led everyone toward the cool and majestic red and yellow palace. Before he reached the palace gate, the Imperial guards in charge of guarding had already divided into a small team to receive him. They silently but thoughtfully shielded him from the wind and welcomed him into the palace gate. This kind of treatment had always only been afforded to the old and frail officials. Even the princes could not receive such generous treatment. Fan Xian could not help but frown, feeling a little confused. He did not know that the first prince had secretly instructed his subordinates. Although the great prince did not say anything, his calm attitude was enough to let all the generals of the Imperial Army know that the rumors had not harmed Fan Xian's position. Furthermore, the relationship between Commissioner Fan and the great prince had long recovered. The person responsible for welcoming him at the palace gates was Eunuch Ho, whom Fan Xian had first met when he entered the palace. The two of them had long become familiar with each other. With a face full of flattery, Eunuch Ho said, "Young Master Fan, it is fortunate that I woke up early today. Who would have thought you would come so early?" Fan Xian jokingly scolded him and asked with a glimmer of confusion, "Last month, you said you were going to the bureau of Shiguan. The last few times I entered the palace, it was Lao Yao who received me. Why are you the one coming out today?" Eunuch Ho had long been promoted to the position of bureau of Shiguan. He was in charge of medicine and funerals in the palace. It was truly an important position. He was a popular figure in the palace. Logically speaking, it should not be his turn to receive Fan Xian outside the palace. Eunuch Ho smiled and said, "Lao Yao has left the palace to take care of business. The emperor had me come today to take his place for a day." Fan Xian nodded and followed him into the palace. Along the way, they passed through the large palace garden, chatting here and there. A moment later, Fan Xian finally sighed and faintly said, "These days I've gotten used to the gazes of others. You're the best, Lao Ho, to treat me like you always have." Eunuch Ho shivered slightly. Immediately after, his heart warmed. He said in a fawning manner, "Look at what you're saying. In the future, young Master Fan will only soar higher and higher. Of course, I have to serve you carefully." Fan Xian didn't expose him. He chuckled and let it go. In reality, he did feel something. After everyone knew of his relationship with the royal family, their expressions would be somewhat unnatural. On the contrary, the eunuchs in the palace did not seem to have much of a reaction. He didn't know that the eunuchs in the Qing royal palace always maintained a balance between the princes. They did not dare to randomly vote for a master. They were not like officials. Once they voted for the wrong master, they could only die after the other side ascended the throne. On the contrary, there was a distance in their respect toward the princes. Furthermore, they served the emperor daily. Other than the crown prince, they were not overly afraid of the other three princes. Whether Fan Xian was a prince or not was not important to the eunuchs. On the contrary, it was his own position that was the reason the eunuchs curried favor with him. They walked past a few familiar palaces and finally arrived in front of the royal study. Eunuch Ho carefully spoke from outside the door. He then turned and gave Fan Xian a meaningful glance before retreating to the side. After the door opened, Fan Xian walked in on his walking stick. Standing in front of the tall bookcase, he pretended to unnaturally place his walking stick to the side and bowed deeply toward the emperor, who was reading memorials on the soft couch. The emperor didn't even raise his head. He grunted and then said, Find a place to sit. We'll talk after I finish reading these. How could he find a place to sit in the royal study? Hong Zhu, who was standing to the side with a horsetail whisk, was very clever. He understood the emperor's meaning and quickly went to the back to bring out an embroidered stool and placed it by Fan Xian's side. Fan Xian smiled gratefully at the little eunuch and sat down. In his heart, he was thinking, why is this child's pimples still so vigorous? The emperor lowered his head as if he did not see this scene. However, a glimmer of a smile flashed through his eyes as he looked at the memorials. It was completely silent in the royal study. No one dared to speak. The eunuchs inside and outside the door did not make a single sound. This was not the first time Fan Xian had been alone with the emperor and Fan Xian. After that rumor had spread, the two of them were alone in the same room. His heart always felt strangely nervous. His chest also felt a little itchy. He couldn't resist coughing. The coughing immediately reverberated throughout the royal study. It was incomparably clear and actually startled himself. The emperor raised his head and glanced at him. He didn't say anything and continued to read through memorials. Fan Xian quickly sat up straight on the bench and began to quietly watch the emperor's daily work. He knew that not many people had the opportunity to see this scene in front of him. It had been too long, and his mind wandered. He began to unconsciously observe the emperor's appearance. Although the emperor's head was slightly lowered, Fan Xian still found a few familiar shadows on his thin face. More accurately, there were places similar to his. This was probably the so-called blood relationship. The emperor read through memorials for a long time. There were many memorials on the desk. His brows were sometimes furrowed angrily, sometimes relaxed happily, sometimes silent and gloomy, and sometimes excited. The territory of the Qing kingdom was vast, with 7 roads and 26 counties under its jurisdiction. There were countless provinces and counties. Using Jingdo as the center to govern the world was a difficult task. Just the number of memorials sent in from all over the country was as numerous as snowflakes. If it was an emperor who followed the principle of ruling from above, perhaps he would give power to the cabinet and go sightseeing every day. However, the current emperor of the Qing kingdom was clearly not willing to be a muddle-headed ruler. He did not relinquish any of the kingdom's power. Thus, he did not hesitate to chase Prime Minister Lin Ruofu out of court and only set up the Hall of Governmental Affairs. This is practically self-torture. Fan Xian calmly watched the scene in front of him. A cold smile flashed through his heart. Being an emperor was indeed not an interesting matter. In comparison, growing flowers like King Jing seemed to be a pretty good choice. The sun gradually moved to the middle of the sky. After the sunlight shone down through the layers of cold clouds, it had been frozen until it lost all its heat. The people in the palace seemed to have forgotten the time. The emperor finally finished his morning edits and closed the last memorial. He closed his eyes and slowly rested his spirit. In the end, he even stretched. The eunuchs filed in. Towels, calming tea, pastries, and incense began to be applied to the emperor's body and stomach. Fan Xian noticed that the towels did not give off a sliver of cold air in this winter. He furrowed his brows and asked, "Your Majesty, is this cold?" The emperor made a sound of acknowledgement and took the towel to rub his face forcefully. Indistinctly, he said, "It's cold to the bone. It can wake the spirit." Fan Xian thought for a bit and finally said, "Your Majesty, try a hot towel. It's good for the body." The emperor was slightly surprised. He then smiled and said, "A hot towel is too warm and comfortable. I'm afraid I'll fall asleep." Fan Xian also smiled. "Use a hot one. The hotter the better." He suddenly seemed to choke. As he coughed, he hurriedly waved his hand and said, "Of course, be careful not to burn yourself." The emperor suddenly revealed a meaningful smile. Glancing at him, he said, "Not bad. You appear relatively calm." Fan Xian was speechless. The emperor's gaze moved to the walking stick behind Fan Xian. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart. This child is as stubborn as his mother. He wants to purposely let me see that he is acting obedient. He wants me to reprimand him and firm his heart. Does he think I don't understand? Thinking of this, The emperor remembered more and more how good someone had been in the past. He also found that Fan Xian was a good son who did not have any improper thoughts. On the contrary, he was somewhat aloof. He rose and walked out of the royal study, indicating for Fan Xian to follow him. Fan Xian quickly went to take the walking stick. The emperor smiled and said, "If I had known that your injuries were almost healed, why did you act pitiful in front of me?" Although it was pointed out, there was no anger on the emperor's face. Fan Xian was startled at just the right time. It was as if he had not expected the emperor to not reprimand him. Immediately after, he chuckled and tossed the walking stick to the side, following the emperor out. Fan Xian won the first psychological confrontation between Fan Xian and his so-called father. Following the long eaves of the palace toward the northwest, the palace buildings gradually became sparse, leaving behind the grand buildings of Hongguang Palace and Taiji Palace. Along the way, all the serving girls and eunuchs they saw humbly lowered their heads and gave way. Behind the emperor and Fan Xian, there was only Hongzhu, the little eunuch. Gradually, as they walked, even the serving girls and eunuchs rarely appeared. The winter garden was incomparably quiet. Occasionally, there was snow on the fake mountains. There were no longer any sounds of birds or insects. There was only a faint silence. Fan Xian knew where they were going, so he was silent. The emperor seemed to be in a strange mood and did not say anything. It was not until even the cold palace had disappeared and the palace buildings appeared to be in a dilapidated state that the emperor stopped his steps. At this moment, there was a quiet little courtyard in front of them. The courtyard was not large. Inside, there was only a two-story wooden building. The building was a bit old. It had probably not been repaired in many years. Following the emperor up the steps and entering, Fan Xian began to feel nervous. He took a deep breath. The outside of the little building was old and broken, but the inside was incomparably clean. There was not a speck of dust on it. Someone had probably cleaned it all year round. Going up to the second floor, in the main hall, the emperor finally sighed and walked out of the building. Looking at the garden across the balcony, he was silent for a long time. The corner of the royal palace, facing the balcony, was already the most isolated and quiet place in the royal palace. The flowers and plants in the garden were not cared for and grew wildly on their own. Then they were bullied by the autumn wind, cold dew, and wild snow and collapse to the ground. They looked like countless corpses that had been killed, pale yellow and white. In the distance, the corner tower of Huayang's sect could faintly be seen. Fan Xian stood silently behind the emperor. It was not good for him to speak, but he had already swept his gaze around the hall. He did not see the portrait he was thinking of. It was like the little eunuch Hongzhu was performing a magic trick. He brought out boiling water from somewhere in the little building and made tea. He respectfully placed it on the table and then obediently went downstairs, not daring to wait at the side. Earlier, I told you to wait in the royal study. The emperor's face was facing the outside of the railing. His hands gripped the railing firmly and powerfully. There was no fluctuation in his voice. I wanted to tell you that a ruler has a ruler's way. Fan Xian remained silent. As the ruler of a country, I must consider the state and the people under heaven, the emperor said slowly. The emperor said slowly, his eyes staring into the distance. Being an emperor is not an easy job. Your mother once said that. So, sometimes I must give up some things, even some things that are very valuable, and leave you in Danzhou for 16 years. Don't blame me. Fan Xian had waited for this day for a long time and had made solid mental preparations. Suddenly hearing these words, he still couldn't stop a chill from traveling up his neck and toward his head. He was so shocked that he didn't know what to say. After a moment of silence, he suddenly bit his lower lip and replied in a clear voice, "I don't know what your majesty means by these words." Fan Xian's reaction seemed to have long been within the emperor's expectations. He smiled self-mockingly and didn't turn his head. However, his tone became even gentler. "Including your brothers, even if the people under heaven have resentment toward me, I'm afraid no one would dare to say it to my face or show it. And Ji, you indeed have some of your mother's legacy." Fan Xian forcefully straightened his neck and stubbornly didn't say a word. "You don't know what I mean by these words?" The emperor turned around. His light yellow robes appeared even more noble by the railing of the winter building. Slowly he said, "What I mean is you are my son." Fan Xian was silent. After a long time, he suddenly smiled. He couldn't help but laugh. It was a silent laugh. There was an indescribable bitterness, grief, and indignation in his laughter. After a long time, he slowly withdrew the smile on his face. For a moment, he was at a loss. He had forgotten earlier, from the moment he entered the palace, whether he was acting according to plan or if he had completely taken the role of the emperor's illegitimate child. It was difficult for him to get out of the act. He bowed deeply toward the emperor, but still wouldn't say anything. The emperor sighed in his heart. He was completely fooled by the emotions Fan Xian displayed. Faintly, he said, "I originally didn't want to acknowledge the rumors in Jingdo, but in the end, I will. And Ji, in the end, you are my flesh and blood." The emperor walked closer to him and looked at the unique determination and stubbornness on the face of this beautiful young man in front of him. An expression of pity appeared on his face and was immediately hidden. He didn't demand that Fan Xian answer. Instead, he said to himself, "You will be 18 next month." Fan Xian abruptly raised his head. He wanted to speak, but then stopped. A moment later, he lightly said, "I don't know when I was born." These words pierced into the emperor's heart. It made this emperor, whose heart had always been ice cold, finally feel a sense of guilt. He thought for a moment and then slowly said, "The 18th of the first month." Fan Xian was slightly surprised. Shortly after, he smiled bitterly and sighed. "I didn't know I was born 18 until I was 18. The emperor smiled warmly. The more he looked at the child in front of him, the more he liked him. Unconsciously, he said, "To be able to raise you into such a sensible child in the countryside, it must have been very hard on your mother in Danzhou. One day, I will also go to Danzhou to visit her. And Ji, how is her health recently?" Fan Xian lowered his head in silence for a moment. No one knew what he was thinking. Finally, he opened his mouth. "Grandmother's health is very good. I often communicate with Danzhou." Oh, hearing that he was finally no longer calling himself an official, the emperor's heart warmed. He smiled comfortingly and began to gently ask about Fan Xian's childhood. The conversation had a prelude. Fan Xian seemed to have adapted to the new relationship between ruler and official. He began to talk about his childhood days to the emperor in front of him. "Everyone, please read the following rhyme aloud." Fan Xian was the emperor's son. At first, the emperor did not know that Fan Xian knew that Fan Xian was the emperor's son. Now, the emperor knew that Fan Xian guessed that Fan Xian was the emperor's son. At first, Fan Xian wanted the emperor not to know that he knew. Now, he wanted the emperor to guess that he just knew but didn't want to know. Thus, the emperor did not know Fan Xian, but Fan Xian knew the emperor. The emperor thought of Fan Xian as a son, but Fan Xian did not think of himself as a son. This was a problem of the mind, and it was also a psychological problem. From the first step he took into the palace, Fan Xian had been using this to retreat step by step and attack step by step. It finally quieted upstairs. This pair of father and son, each with their own ulterior motives, sat apart, drinking tea and chatting. Although Fan Xian still did not speak, his expression had already calmed. His conversation with the emperor was no longer restricted to the memorials between ruler and official. He could talk about the gossip outside the palace, his life these years in Danzhou, and the small matters of his family. Thus, the emperor began to revel in this kind of atmosphere. This was exactly what Fan Xian needed. Chapter 329. As the ruler of a country, he had many matters to attend to. He could not always stay in this remote part of the palace. He didn't know which part of the country had something happening. The head eunuch of Taiji Palace put on a thick face and took a great risk to come outside the building. He bitterly reported downstairs many times before finally successfully inviting the emperor to come downstairs. Seeing Commissioner Fan standing behind the emperor, the head eunuch silently groaned in his heart. No wonder the palace could not find the emperor. It turned out that the father and son were playing a tearful game of recognizing each other. He had rashly come and disturbed the emperor and made him unhappy. He didn't know how many beatings he would receive. The emperor's expression was indeed not good. Of the sons he had, the one he admired the most was Fan Xian. After Fan Xian entered Jingdo, he had brought too much glory to him and the entire Qin kingdom. Furthermore, he was intelligent and sensible. He could be of great use. The most important thing was that he had saved the third brother in the floating temple, and now that he had refused to acknowledge him, it was easy to see that under the child's sloppy appearance, there was a loyal heart. His methods seemed to be cruel, but they were all filled with the intention of moderation. In the heart of this middle-aged emperor, how could he not have felt a sliver of unreasonable jealousy toward Fan Jian? In the end, the emperor was only a mortal. Now, he could finally recognize Fan Xian. Although Fan Xian had not spoken, the atmosphere was enough to make the emperor happy. However, at this time, someone had come to disturb them. Of course, his mood was not very good. At this time, there were too many people inside and outside the building, so it was not good for the emperor to say anything more. He turned around. His frosty face gradually softened. Gazing at Fan Xian's beautiful and somewhat familiar face, he quietly said, "You've seen and said earlier, as the ruler of a country, there are always too many things that you have no choice but to do. Think about it yourself. Don't have too much resentment in your heart." Given the dignity of the emperor, even if the person in front of him was his own son, he would not lower himself to speak like this. Other than not expressing apology, these words had already expressed enough. Fan Xian did not continue to pretend. He bowed deeply and seemed to be moved. The emperor suddenly furrowed his brows and thought of his sister far away in Xinjiang. He couldn't help but feel a headache coming on. He sighed and said, "Recently, the capital has not been very peaceful, and there are too many things that cannot be brought to the table. Chun Pingping is worried that you will be embarrassed in court, so he has suggested that you go to Jiangnan ahead of time. What do you think?" Fan Xian did not dare to have any objections. Just at the right time, a glimmer of darkness flashed through his eyes. Faintly, he said, "As you wish." He suddenly smiled warmly. "I have never been to Jiangnan before. Please tell me what I need to pay attention to, Your Majesty." The emperor shook his head. "What I need is a clean palace treasury that can earn money for the court every year. As for what to do, you should be clear. In the past 2 months, what you have done, I admire it very much." Naturally, he was talking about the Overwatch Council investigating the Chui family and attacking the palace treasury smuggling. The emperor continued, "Only because of this, and you have made a few enemies in court. There are some things that I am not good at. You have done well." In the emperor's eyes, the reason why Fan Xian had spared no effort in attacking Xinjiang and the second prince was, of course, because of that memorial. He was working for the court and handling matters that he could not easily appear in. After a moment of silence, Fan Xian opened his mouth and said, "From now on, I am still willing to be Your Majesty's lone official." The emperor was very satisfied with Fan Xian's attitude. Fan Xian took this opportunity to ask, "However, Jiangnan is far away. Although I have the power of supervision, I am not familiar with business. If all matters were to be led by the council alone, I am afraid I would not be able to investigate clearly. Your Majesty, He gritted his teeth in front of the emperor and said, "I would like to borrow Qingyu Hall." The emperor was surprised. After a moment of silence, he asked, "The shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall are naturally familiar with the affairs of the palace treasury. However, according to the rules of the court, they are not allowed to leave the capital." He suddenly felt that saying this in front of Fan Xian was not very kind. He coughed twice and said, "Enji, you are asking me for people in front of me. Are you not afraid that I will suspect your intentions?" Fan Xian straightforwardly said, "The land of Putian is not the land of the king. Since I have brought it up in front of you, I naturally believe that Your Majesty deeply believes in my loyalty." The emperor stared at him, but his heart was quickly circling. Back then, the Yi family had deep roots and could almost shake the system of the country. As the ruler of a country, He was truly afraid that the events of the past would repeat themselves. After all, Fan Xian was his own son. It was inevitable that he would be a little unwilling to lose the Yi family. But he thought about it again. Since Fan Xian dared to say these words, he could be considered honest. He opened his mouth and lightly said, "Now that you are standing high enough, you naturally know that so-called real gold and silver are not very useful. As for the palace treasury, 6 years ago, I decided to let you control it when you grew up. It was because of that thought. This was originally my wish." Was there to doubt? Fan Xian's expression showed that he was moved, but the emperor waved his hand and laughed mockingly. "But don't try to hide it from me. Even though the affairs of the palace treasury are complicated, there is no need for those old fellows of Qingyu Hall. With your request, I think you want to fish them out of the capital." Fan Xian did not argue. He sadly sighed and said, "I dare not lie to your majesty. I do indeed have this thought. From the first day I found out about my past, I had this thought. Last year, I even went to Qingyu Hall to see. Those shopkeepers are confined to the capital all year round. It is truly a bit awkward. These people are not even 50 years old. If they were released into the capital, they could still serve the court." Last year, he had taken a trip to Qingyu Hall. He knew that this matter would one day be discovered by someone with ulterior motives, so he might as well say it in front of the emperor. The emperor seemed to be surprised by his calmness. After a moment of silence, he finally nodded. Fan Xian was overjoyed. The emperor laughed in spite of himself. "You can't take them all. The manners of the nobles are all managed by Qingyu Hall. If you take them all, I'm afraid King Jing will be the first to not forgive you." Fan Xian chuckled. The emperor smiled slightly and said, "Of all of them, only Prince Huqing dares to stand up straight and speak in front of me. His temperament is calm and fierce. How about you?" He stopped and said, "There is a painting in the side room upstairs. Go take a look in a moment." Although he clearly knew that the painting was in the royal palace, Fan Xian still showed slight hesitation and asked, "What painting?" The emperor said, "The only painting your mother left in this world." Thinking of Xiao Yezi, his gaze softened. In a quiet voice, he said, "You have never seen her. Take a good look at her in a moment. Speaking of which, your mother and you're not very similar." Fan Xian was slightly startled. He then heard the emperor sigh and say, "Although they were both incomparably beautiful, their temperaments were very different. She was like a man and did not give in to men. Otherwise, she would not have such a name. Back then, she hated the so-called poems and songs the most, so she could only practice them." Thinking of the son in front of him who was the most famous poet in the world, the emperor suddenly felt that the matter was interesting. He laughed loudly and pointed at Fan Xian. Although the poems she made had the power to swallow up the wind and clouds, they only matched her temperament. "The difference from yours is too great, too great." Hongzhu looked at the eunuch's anxious and urging gaze outside the building. Hearing the emperor and Sir Fan Jr.'s happy conversation, he did not dare to go forward and disturb them. Fan Xian smiled and asked curiously, "Mother, have you heard the poem she made before?" "Only one." The emperor leisurely thought back to the past and recited in a clear voice, "The scenery of the north, 1,000 li sealed in ice, 10,000 li of snow floating. Inside and outside the palace, there was only a vast expanse. Up and down the great river, there was suddenly no torrent. The mountains danced like silver snakes. The plains rode like wax elephants, wanting to compete with the heavens. On a clear day, looking at the red makeup and plain clothes, it was exceptionally enchanting. The rivers and mountains were so beautiful, attracting countless heroes to bend their backs. Pity Emperor Han Wu of Wei, slightly lacking in literary talent. Ancestor song of the Tang sect, slightly lacking in elegance. The pride of a generation, the Khan of the Western savages, only knew how to draw a bow and shoot a large eagle. It is all in the past. Counting the distinguished figures, we will still look to the present. Emperor Han Wu of Wei, ancestor song of the Tang sect. Fan Xian's expression was very interesting, so interesting that he was about to cramp. The emperor glanced at him with disapproval and scolded, "Do you think this poem is not good, Fan Xian said with a pained expression. Naturally, it is full of vigor. However, I do not know who this Emperor Han Wu, Tang sect, and ancestor song are. He thought to himself, Mother, if you want to change, then change it completely. What con of the Western savages? I have truly lost to you. The Emperor explained. Rumor has it that they were the 3 heroes of a generation from ancient times. Fan Xian was speechless. He thought that his mother's skill at making excuses was very similar to his own. It was just like that night in Shangjing, northern Qi, with Zhuang Mohan. Anything that could not be explained clearly would be pushed back to ancient times. He had occasionally seen it in the annals of history, but where was the annals of history? Sorry, I tore up to use in the toilet. The eunuch asked again and again, and the emperor finally left the little building. As he left, there was no trace of sadness in his thin figure. There was only Hong Zhu and Fan Xian left in the little building. Watching the emperor's figure disappear behind the layers of hanging frost branches, Fan Xian finally couldn't resist exploding. Holding his stomach, he laughed loudly. Ha ha! The sound rang through the little building with unspeakable joy. To the side, Hong Zhu was dumbstruck. He wondered if Commissioner Fan had been greatly affected by what had happened today. Should he ask the royal doctor to come and take a look? After a long time, Fan Xian finally stopped the ridiculous laughter brought about by spring in Qin Garden. His stomach hurt from laughing. Breathlessly, he said to Hong Zhu, It's nothing. I'll go up myself. Wait for me downstairs. As he walked up the stairs, Fan Xian still couldn't stop himself from wanting to laugh. That woman called Yi Qingmei was truly a wonderful person. She didn't copy thousands of good poems, but she had to copy this one. He guessed that she had been forced into a corner by Emperor Fan Jian and his group of people. However, perhaps old Mao's poem suited that woman's state of mind? By the time he reached the top floor, Fan Xian's smile had completely disappeared. He had recovered his usual calm. Placed in a feudal dynasty, the poem his mother copied was truly an antinomian poem. The emperor could say it, but she couldn't. No wonder she had such a serious conflict with the royal palace in the end. He smiled coldly in his heart. He threw all of the true feelings of the emperor to the back of his mind and did not think about it again. Arriving outside the side room, Fan Xian casually picked up the cup of cold tea on the table and pushed open the door. Stepping over the threshold, he did not hesitate or tremble. Calmly, he stood in front of the portrait. In the painting was a yellow-robed woman. In the background was a surging river. The woman stood on a green rock by the river. The skirt on her body swayed gently in the river wind. She faced the direction of the river. The turbid waves in the river rose into the air, slapping against the rocks and turning them into mud. On the opposite bank, in the distance, one could faintly see people the size of ants moving rocks or something. Perhaps they were building the river embankment. The painting's workmanship was exquisite. The brush strokes were exquisite, but the style was grand and majestic. It was detailed to the point of being grand. Regardless of whether it was the heavy scene on the other side of the river or the green and yellow mountain rocks nearby, they were all described very well. In particular, the river bound between the two sides of the yellow mountain was even more turbulent. The waves turned white, and it was imposing. Looking at this painting, it was as if one could feel a fierce river wind seeping out from the painting and blowing on the viewer's face. If one stood slightly closer, it was as if one could hear the impassioned sound of the river water slapping against the two sides of the river. However, none of this was the main point of this painting. Anyone lucky enough to see this painting would be immediately attracted by the yellow-robed woman standing on the other side of the river. They would no longer have any spare thoughts of looking at the scenery and people in other parts of the painting. The yellow-robed woman only revealed one side of her face. A few strands of black hair by her earlobes, as translucent as jade, gently fluttered. Her lips were slightly pursed. No one knew what she was thinking about. What attracted one's gaze the most were her eyebrows. Those eyebrows were clear and beautiful like swords. They did not seem like those of a weak woman, but they also did not have a hint of manly heroism. They were only clear and carefree. At this moment, Fan Xian's gaze was only focused on the side of the woman's face in the painting. The expression in the eyes appeared calm, but it always seemed to contain even more emotion. In just an instant, he remembered that in the cave on the precipice of Western Mountain outside Shangjing in northern Qi, Xiao En had once described his mother to him. Yes, it was this kind of gaze. Soft, sorrowful, filled with love and attachment to life. Yearning for beautiful things, sympathy for suffering, and the confidence to change everything. Fan Xian sighed and slowly sat down. Looking at the painting on the wall, he did not move his gaze for a long time. It was as if he wanted to firmly engrave the woman's appearance in the painting into his heart. With cold tea in his hand and the old painting in front of him, he sat silently in the side room. He didn't know how long he sat there, but he didn't notice the sun outside, the little building shift, and the wind and clouds slowly move. The cold tea in his hand was still untouched. Fan Xian had sat for half a day. His lips were a bit dry. He suddenly tilted his head and looked at the yellow-robed woman in the painting. In a quiet voice, he said, "You did well. Unfortunately, you didn't take care of yourself." He paused as if he was a bit nervous. He wanted to organize a more suitable words to say to the woman in the painting. "Of course, I didn't do as well as you, but please don't worry. I will certainly take care of myself." He stood up and looked calmly at the painting. In a quiet voice, he said, "I'll leave you here for now. Presumably, he won't let me take it away. In a few days, I will often come to see you." He didn't know how much time would pass. Fan Xian moved closer to the painting and suddenly smiled brightly. Full of vigor, he smiled and said, "It's all in the past. It's all in the past. Let me deal with the romantic figures." After saying this, he rose and left the side room. The room was completely silent. The door suddenly creaked and was hurriedly pushed open. Fan Xian returned and stood in the side room again. Looking straight at the woman in the painting, he abruptly opened his mouth and asked, "Science? A female doctor?" Naturally, the woman in the painting could not answer the question her son would ask many years later, so she only remained silent. Fan Xian's heart involuntarily ached. Shortly after, he chuckled and hid the wetness in his eyes. Sincerely, he bowed and said, "Thank you." Then he actually left. The yellow-robed woman in the painting did not turn around. She only looked at the scene across the river. She was silent with her back to the door behind her. No one knew how long it would take for it to open again. Originally, I had written a few hundred words, but this chapter can only end here. This is the only way to express my sincerity towards Yi Qing Mei and myself. Today I am 30 years old. In life, I always think about all sorts of things. So today, I'm also inexplicably sad and angry, crying bitterly. I really don't want to be 40. Fortunately, the Vermilion Bird Chronicles is finished, and I'm satisfied with it. Then I have an explanation for my life, and I can slowly explain it in the future. This kind of life can be considered relatively happy, because I really like writing and making up stories. And on the day I was born, I just happened to write this chapter. It is also a kind of happiness. Finally, I recommend a book, Magical Acupuncture. It is not a friendly recommendation. I only read it because a friend recommended it. I don't understand Chinese medicine, so I just wanted to read it for fun. But in some of the details, I can see the sincerity of YY. I like it. P.S. I will definitely be drinking today, so I may update later tomorrow with fewer updates. Chapter 330. Walking out the door, Fan Xian put down the cup of cold tea in his hand. With a clang, the teacup accurately landed on top of the other teacup on the table. The two teacups were stacked on top of each other, and not much tea spilled out. Pressing the teacup against the previous teacup was a very ordinary and casual action. He came down the stairs and quietly said something to Hongzhu. The two of them left the little building and followed the cold stone path in the palace in that direction. After seeing Fan Xian out of the royal palace, Hongzhu circled around Taiji Palace and went through the curved stone door to the royal study to give his report. Along the way, he joked with the palace maids and chatted with the little eunuchs for a while. It was an indescribable joy. The eunuchs and serving girls were also surprised. They thought, ever since eunuch Hongzhu had been at the emperor's side, his status had risen. Even his temperament had become steadier and more ruthless. What had happened to make him so happy? Seeing that the royal study was not far away, Hongzhu came to his senses and knew that he had acted a bit too much. He quickly stopped in his tracks and grabbed 2 handfuls of snow from the mountain rocks by the side of the road. He fiercely rubbed at his face, forcefully cooling the heated skin on his face. Only then did he relax. He coughed lightly a few times and imitated eunuch Hong, the ancestor of the eunuchs in the palace. With a deadly serious expression, he pushed open the door to the royal study. At this moment, the emperor was arguing with Shu the scholar about something. Their voices were very loud. This Shu the scholar was truly daring. He did not yield an inch in front of the emperor. He could only vaguely hear that it was some river channel, transfer of funds, and Ministry of Revenue matter. Hongzhu's ears perked up, and he waited to the side. He didn't even dare to breathe too loudly. He knew exactly what it was for Shu the scholar to have the courage to go against the emperor. This winter was a good time to dredge the river. The Hall of Governmental Affairs had already drawn up the rules 2 months ago. They were only waiting for the Ministry of Revenue to gather silver before organizing the various provinces and counties to recruit people and repair the river. However, he had not expected that the Ministry of Revenue would not be able to take out so much silver. The shortfall was too great and seriously delayed the repair of the river. Thus, Minister Fan became the target of public criticism. If it were not for the emperor's protection, Minister Fan would have asked to resign no matter what. The kingdom of Qing was in its golden age, yet the national treasury could not take out enough silver. The Hall of Governmental Affairs asked the Ministry of Revenue, but the Ministry of Revenue did not know anything, only saying that the palace had transferred it. But the palace's expenses had always come from the palace treasury. Could it be that the palace treasury had fallen to such a state? The matter of the palace treasury involved the eldest princess and the face of the royal family. Furthermore, the Overwatch Council had recently been investigating the Chui clan, and the spearhead was pointed at the palace treasury. At this time, the officials in the court could not ask the emperor directly. As a result, Grand Scholar Shu's trip to the palace came about. It seemed that the interaction between the monarch and the minister was not very peaceful. The emperor coughed and vaguely said Fan Xian, Jiangnan, and a few other indistinct words. Shu the scholar's expression finally improved a little. It was as if he believed that after Fan Xian went to Jiangnan, he would be able to solve the Qing kingdom's financial problems. The old scholar lowered his voice, but his face was full of worry. I'm afraid that we won't make it in time. What if there's another flood next year? The affairs of Jiangnan are complicated. Even if Commissioner Fan is exceptionally talented, if you want to sort it all out, it will probably take a year. Even if the heavens are looking out for you next year, what about the year after? The emperor smiled and comforted Shu Wu. Fan Xian will leave in a few days. He should be able to make it in time. Shu Wu made a sound of acknowledgement and left the royal study with a smile. In reality, both monarch and official were experienced and prudent people. How could they truly stop worrying just because a young man like Fan Xian was going to Jiangnan? Furthermore, what Shu the scholar was fighting for was not just these things on the surface. As the head of the civil officials in court, he needed the emperor's stance on what to do with the palace treasury. More importantly, after the 2 rumors had come out one after the other, how exactly was the court, or rather, the palace, going to deal with Fan Xian? The royal family played with mysteries and kept many things a secret. However, the system of officials in court could not stand this. Everyone was anxious and always wanted a definite answer. Since the emperor had clearly stated the date of Fan Xian's departure from Jingdou, it was to announce that the management of the palace treasury would certainly begin, and it would begin very forcefully. It was also to tell the officials in court through Shu Wu that Fan Xian's identity had temporarily come to an end. Regardless of whether he was a remnant of the rebellious Yi family or the emperor's illegitimate child, in any case, he had already left Jingdou. Stop guessing blindly and let the matter fade. Hongzhu. The emperor suddenly woke from his deep thoughts and asked, what was his reaction earlier? Hongzhu was startled and quickly replied in a low voice. There were glistening tears in Commissioner Fan's eyes and an expression of relief. He once laughed loudly 3 times in the building, but I don't know why. At such a young age, he was able to personally follow by the Emperor's side. Naturally, he was more quick-witted than most people. Of course, he knew that the Emperor spoke of was Sir Fan Jr., who had just left the palace. The Emperor's expression darkened slightly. Shortly after, he smiled slightly and said, "This is also good. After letting go, it will be easier to work for the court without any worries." Hongzhu gave a small smile and didn't dare to continue. He was quite frightened by the Emperor's following words. "Starting next month, go serve at the Empress's side." The Emperor caressed a piece of calming jade in his palm and said casually. It was like a bolt of lightning striking the little eunuch's heart. With a thud, Hongzhu knelt down stiffly on the ground. Crying, he said, "Your Majesty, I don't know what I did wrong. Please, Your Majesty, beat me to death, but don't chase me away." The Emperor furrowed his brows and looked at him. He said with disgust, "What kind of future do you have? I wanted you to go to the palace to be the head eunuch. I promoted you, yet you are so scared. You really can't be of much use." Hongzhu's heart was in a mess. He knew he had made a mistake, but his face was still covered in snot and tears. He wailed, "I don't want to be some head eunuch. I just want to be at your side." "Oh." The Emperor looked at the little eunuch in front of him with a not-quite-there smile and said, "What are the benefits of being at my side?" The word benefit could be used as a joke, but it could also be used as a beheading knife. Hongzhu raised his head from the ground in a daze. His tear-stained face was stained with dust. He muttered, "Serving by the Emperor's side is a servant's face. Glory?" Hongzhu pounded his head like garlic. Sobbing, he said, "I deserve to die. I shouldn't have been greedy." His heart was like a mirror. No one in the palace cared if a eunuch took a bribe, but it depended on the mood of these masters. "How much silver did you take?" The Emperor looked at the little eunuch's face covered in dust and tears. His appearance was very funny and actually laughed out loud. Hearing the laughter, Hongzhu's heart calmed slightly. He slowly replied, "I've been in the royal study for 2 months and took a total of 400 liang of silver." The Emperor's face suddenly darkened and a chill rose. He coldly said, "Is that so? Then who bought the 800 mu of land in Jiaozhou for you? Your brother's official position. Who gave you the connections? You are very daring. You haven't even been at my side for 100 days, and you've already done such a thing." Hongzhu's face was pale. All his hopes turned to dust. He wailed loudly, "I know my crime, I know my crime." He didn't even dare to beg the Emperor to spare his life. Who was it? The Emperor turned around and kicked off his boots. He sat on the couch and began to read memorials again. Hongzhu's face was green and then white. He knew he could not hide it in the end. He gritted his teeth and said, "It was Commissioner Fan." The Emperor's expression did not change. He gently made a sound of doubt. Hongzhu suddenly used his hands and feet to crawl to the Emperor's feet. Raising his face, he sobbed, "Your Majesty, you can kill me as much as you want, but the heavens can be my witness. I am loyal and devoted to your Majesty. I definitely did not secretly. The commissioner is a good person. I beg him to do this. Please spare him." Only now did the Emperor reveal a glimmer of surprise. "Oh, you're actually pleading for him?" He immediately laughed out loud and said, "It looks like this child's relations with people are much better than I imagined." The Emperor looked at the little eunuch's messy face and laughingly scolded, "Get out. Fan Xian has long reported this matter to me. If I didn't like the fact that you're a little clever, he would have killed you long ago. You're actually pleading for him?" "Ah." Hongzhu's face was filled with shock and embarrassment. He didn't come back to his senses for a moment. "Still not getting out?" "Yes, Your Majesty." Hongzhu's face was sullen, but his heart was overjoyed. He didn't get up and just crawled out of the royal study. As for whether he would be chased to the Empress's palace to be the head eunuch or some other way out, at this moment, he didn't care. After leaving the royal study and running into a side room, Hongzhu finally calmed his panting breath. Only now did he feel how cold the cold sweat on his back was. Accepting a towel, he carelessly wiped the tears, sweat, and dust on his face. In annoyance, he chased all of his subordinates out. It wasn't until he sat alone in his room that he began to feel a lingering fear. Sir Fan Jr. is right. There is nothing in this world that can be hidden from the Emperor, the little eunuch thought with lingering fear. If the Emperor allows you to be greedy, then you can be greedy. So, you might as well do everything in the open. At this moment, his admiration for Fan Xian was already deeply embedded in his bones. Other than admiration, he felt a great deal of gratitude toward Fan Xian. The other party could guess that the Emperor didn't care about the little eunuch at his side being greedy. This was only because Sir Fan Jr. was extraordinarily intelligent. Sir Fan Jr. used this matter to hide the most important matter. This was the key. In the future, if he walked closer to Sir Fan Jr., the Emperor would not be suspicious. Thinking of that matter, the little eunuch Hong Zhu's eyes narrowed. He was unspeakably grateful. However, he was about to be moved out of the royal study. He didn't know if he would be able to help Sir Fan Jr. in the future. In the carriage of the Li Palace, Fan Xian half closed his eyes and rested. Gouda and the 2 tiger guards had been sent out of the carriage by him. Inside the carriage was Su Wenmao. He closed his eyes and thought. Although he couldn't determine whether or not there were spies from the palace in the Qinian unit, he had run into Wang Qinian and had Wang Qinian pick up these unsuccessful Overwatch Council officials to the side. For him, the people he could trust the most were these people. If he wanted to do something, he could only trust them. Is there any conclusion to the Yingzhou matter? He asked with furrowed brows. Su Wenmao was not driving the carriage. He carefully listened to the movements outside the carriage before quietly saying, "Sir, don't worry. After the Yingzhou Zhizhou was imprisoned, he died of illness. He didn't go through the council's methods and use your medicine. The coroner won't be able to find anything." Fan Xian nodded. If it can be confirmed that it is safe, then don't touch the Zhizhou's family. This matter ends here. You should know what to do. Su Wenmao nodded. He knew that the commissioner had warned him to keep it a secret. For the commissioner to trust him with such a shady matter, it meant that he had finally succeeded in becoming his confidant. But, as a confidant, he had to think for Fan Xian. He still disapproved of this matter in the depths of his heart. Secretly killing a Zhizhou, a 4th-level official, was something that had rarely happened in the many years since the Overwatch Council was founded. In the future, if nothing happened, the entire Overwatch Council would be out of luck. Furthermore, the Zhizhou had no faction and was a pure student of the Emperor. Seeming to guess what Su Wenmao was thinking, Fan Xian smiled coldly. That Zhizhou had no regard for human life and forcibly seized the property of the villagers. He traveled with bandits and massacred villages and exterminated clans. I only took his life, and that was already going easy on him. Su Wenmao said with concern, "Sir, although it is so, we never had concrete evidence. The captured bandits are very tight-lipped and refuse to testify against the Zhizhou." "Nonsense," Fan Xian said. "If I could have evidence, why would I use such methods?" Su Wenmao shook his head in disapproval. "In the end, it is still too risky. In the worst case, you could write a memorial to the Hall of Governmental Affairs, or even skip the Hall of Governmental Affairs and directly report to the Emperor. Although there is no concrete evidence, the Emperor would still take the Zhizhou for your sake." Fan Xian smiled and shook his head without saying anything more. The matter of that Zhizhou must not be known to the Emperor. He closed his eyes and leisurely rested, but his mind was spinning quickly. The reason he had to deal with the Zhizhou, so far from Jingdou, was because he wanted to do the little eunuch Hong Zhu a favor. A huge favor, one that Hong Zhu would have to repay in the future. The little eunuch Hong Zhu who worked in the royal study was from Yingzhou. His original surname was Chun. When a Zhizhou who had been killed by Fan Xian was still a county magistrate, he had once forcefully taken away the Chun family business because of a certain mountain product. Unfortunately, the Chun family had produced 2 scholars. Naturally, they did not agree. They crossed mountains and ridges and crossed prefectures to file a lawsuit. They even said they would take the lawsuit all the way to Jingdou. In his terror, the county magistrate made a vicious move. In the middle of the night, he colluded with bandits and forcefully destroyed the Chun family. It was unknown how many people died that night. Hong Zhu and his brother were still children at the time. After playing on a mountain, they forgot to go home. They were lucky to escape this tragedy. The two brothers were smart. They crossed the mountain that night and begged all the way to Shandong Road. They no longer dared to go to the Yamen to file a complaint. They only struggled to live in the mortal world with great difficulty. Finally, one day, the two brothers could not endure it anymore. Little brother Chun, who was now Hong Zhu, learned a magical martial art and threw himself into the palace with blood in his crotch. After entering the palace, little brother Chun lived a timid life. He was bullied by older eunuchs and pinched by damned old serving girls. Under the humiliation, fear grew. He didn't even dare to say his surname. Coincidentally, one day, little brother Chun was carrying water and passing by the side of Hongguang Palace. He ran into old eunuch Hong sleeping and resting outside the room. The old eunuch was only wearing old clothes from many years ago. He was not wearing palace robes. Little brother Chun did not recognize the other person's identity. He looked at the old eunuch leaning against a broken bamboo chair with a few flies flying around his face. He felt that this old eunuch was so pitiful. They were both people who had fallen to the ends of the earth, but little brother Chun still had a warm heart. Thinking that he had nothing to do, he went back to the room and took out a broken palm leaf fan. He began to fan eunuch Hong to chase away the flies. When old eunuch Hong woke up, it was not like the usual scene in the story where the little eunuch Chun was taught the supreme divine skill and accepted as his little brother, allowing him to do whatever he wanted in the palace and eat and drink while everywhere. It was just the kindness of Fan. Eunuch Hong knew that the little eunuch did not have a surname, so he only gave him one word, Hong. At the time, the old eunuch was lying on the bamboo chair, so he casually let him be called Zhu. This was the origin of the name Hong Zhu, the later popular great eunuch. From that day on, old eunuch Hong no longer cared about Hong Zhu's life or death. He didn't even say a word to him. Even after Hong Zhu went to the royal study and tried to find ways to curry favor with old eunuch Hong, the old eunuch ignored him. However, the little eunuch had a name. His surname was Hong, and his name was Zhu. The surname Hong represented something special in the palace. Furthermore, old eunuch Hong did not express any opposition. Gradually, people began to spread the word that Hong Zhu was old eunuch Hong's new adopted grandson. No one dared to bully him anymore. On the contrary, they had to curry favor with him. They begged him to do any easy or dignified work. Hong Zhu was a clever person. After experiencing the tragedy of his childhood, his temperament was very steady. There were also so many opportunities in front of him. In addition, Old Dai had lost power and the people in the palace had changed several times. This allowed the little eunuch's luck to flourish. He entered the royal study and began to work at the emperor's side. This was the so-called opportunity. He had seen a lot and knew that the royal palace was just like this. The Zhizhou was not a high-ranking official. The fire of revenge in Hong Zhu's heart began to burn. However, he was young and did not know how to do it. He had no idea how to proceed. Was he supposed to directly state his grievances to the emperor? He didn't have the guts. Coincidentally, at this moment, heaven sent a person in front of him. The carriage jolted. Fan Xian slowly woke up and yawned. His spirit appeared a bit weary. The matter of Hong Zhu had been dug out by him. He did not let Hong Zhu know about the follow-up. He had only silently done it and only told him today. Fan Xian knew that given the trend of Hong Zhu's development in the palace and the degree of trust the emperor had in him, in less than 3 years, this little eunuch would certainly have considerable influence. At that time, he would casually say a word, and there would be many people from the 6 ministries in court willing to risk their lives for him and help him get revenge. Thus, he had to do it 3 years ago. Furthermore, he had to do it cleanly. He had to do it without threats, show no favoritism, and leave no future trouble. This was a top-notch method of giving favors. The Zhizhou who died was the Zhizhou of Yingzhou. Hong Zhu was recorded as a Jiaozhou person. The two places were very far apart. The case of the family massacre had happened too long ago. No one remembered it. Fan Xian was not worried that someone would guess Hong Zhu's connection to this matter. On this point, he was very careful and didn't tell anyone. In the future, even if the emperor found out that the Zhizhou of Yingzhou had died an abnormal death and found that it was the Overwatch Council who did it, Fan Xian would be able to find a basket of excuses. As long as it had nothing to do with the people around him and nothing important in the palace, the life of a mere Zhizhou, in the emperor's eyes, was not as valuable as his own son's. He lifted the corner of the carriage window and narrowed his eyes to look at the already distant and indistinct corner tower of the royal palace. He wished the little eunuch would be able to soar in there. To be continued. If you want to know what happened after, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 331. The carriage stopped in front of the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian got off and walked directly into the council. Along the way, he smiled and greeted the officials he met. This was the first time he had come to the council after the chaos of rumors, so he found that the gazes of the council officials were burning. In reality, many of the lower-level officials did not know who Yi Qingmei was. Every day, they looked at those lines of glittering words and that name that looked down on all men. After a long time, they would always feel a familial sense of familiarity and closeness. Under Chun Pingping's deliberate and unintentional connivance, the heads of the 8 bureaus, Zhong Zhuai, and the other old fellows all began to proclaim to their subordinates what kind of business the Yi family had once been and what the Yi family had done for the Overwatch Council. In the end, they raised this theory to the point that without the Yi family, there would be no Overwatch Council. After all, the Yi family had fallen because of the crime of rebellion. At first, hearing their superiors praise the Yi family without restraint, the officials of the Overwatch Council couldn't help but feel anxious. However, they found that the court did not seem to be afraid of this, and Commissioner Fan's other identity was also very interesting. Thus, everyone began to be interested in some of the details of the past. After a few rounds of brainwashing, the people of the council felt a great sense of closeness toward the Yi family. There was a feeling of the relationship between soldiers and water. Now that they knew Commissioner Fan was the biological son of the name on the stone tablet, their gazes when they looked at Commissioner Fan were not only the usual respect, but also a glimmer of true fear and closeness. No wonder the old director would do everything he could to have this seemingly weak young master take over the Overwatch Council. The people of the Qing Kingdom, regardless of whether they were officials or commoners, all paid attention to what was right and proper. Fan Xian had gradually demonstrated his strength and sufficient intelligence in council affairs. He also had the identity of being a descendant of the Yi family that could not be announced but was known by the hearts of the people. It would be of great help to him taking full control of the Overwatch Council. At least, the suspicions of the people inside had basically been eliminated. Fan Xian did not have the time to use this opportunity to subdue the thousands of officials in the council. He hurriedly walked to the large plain surrounded by the square building. The winter snow had already faded, and the spring wind was still far away. The tall trees were desolate and bare, and the shallow pond was frozen like a mirror. The fish inside had probably died long ago. Chen Pingping sat in the wheelchair, wrapped in a thick fur coat. He listened to the sobbing and mellow singing. His eyes were slightly closed, and his right hand was gently tapping the wheelchair's handle to the rhythm. Da-da-da-da. This scene easily made Fan Xian think of a world in which there were also old men who liked to sit on old rattan chairs. The afternoon sun slipped into the alley. The old phonograph was playing an old Shanghai record. Yao Li's or Bai Hong's soft and mellow singing mingled with the specks of sunlight. But the problem was that Chun Pingping was not Li Jingguang, and he was not listening to a phonograph. The old man's level was much higher than the average person's. Fan Xian didn't have time to appreciate the old cripple's feudalistic petty bourgeoisie. He looked sympathetically at Sang One, who was standing under a withered tree in the middle of winter, singing nonstop. Her face was red from the cold, but her voice did not tremble. He didn't know if it was because she was used to singing in the cold, or if her singing skills were truly amazing. What a waste of a heavenly gift. Fan Xian waved his hand for Sang Wen to stop. He smiled and said, I invited Sang Wen to the courtyard to borrow her abilities, not to have her sing for you. Chen Pingping opened his eyes and smiled. The division of labor is different, but it is all to serve the court. If Sang Wen can make me happy, I can live a few more years. It is much better than staying by your side. Fan Xian's heart jumped. He knew what Chen Pingping meant. It looked like he also knew that his body could not hold out for much longer. I have to leave immediately. He gently patted the back of Chen Pingping's wrinkled and dry hand. I'm taking Sang Wen with me. Balua Brothel still needs to develop in Jiangnan. She can leave in the spring. Chen Pingping sighed. Going with the third prince, it will be good to look after him. Fan Xian felt very angry. How could he have almost forgotten about the third prince's matter? Sang Wen bowed respectfully and then left with Su Wenmao, leaving room for the old and young Overwatch Council officials to speak. They were far away, so they couldn't hear what Chen Pingping and Fan Xian were saying. They could only see Fan Xian half crouching on the ground, his expression growing heavier and heavier. After a moment of silence, Chen Pingping smiled again and gently patted Fan Xian's head as if to comfort him. Let's go, Fan Xian said to Su Wenmao. He then glanced at Sang Wen beside him. He had single-handedly rescued Sang Wen from Balua Brothel and had directly transferred her into the Overwatch Council. She could be considered someone he trusted. However, these days, Sang Wen basically had no opportunity to stay by his side. Instead, she was responsible for singing for Chen Pingping every day. How have you been recently, Miss Sang? Fan Xian asked. Sang Wen smiled warmly. Her slightly plump cheeks looked very happy, and her slightly big mouth was not too glaring. She said harmoniously, I don't have anything else to do every day. I just sing some songs for the old man. It's very relaxing. Very good. Fan Xian smiled warmly. Fan Xian smiled and said, according to the director's intentions, you can go to Jiangnan in a few months. These days, he suddenly paused and said evenly, you stay by the director's side and make him happier. The carriage stopped in front of the Overwatch Council and prepared to head in the direction of the 28-Li Hill. The date the Emperor had set for Fan Xian to leave the capital was too close, and there was too little time. It caught Fan Xian unprepared. There were many things he had to arrange before leaving the capital that had to be done within these few days. Thus, he appeared particularly busy today. Gouda and the other 3 tiger guards were still not in the carriage. Fan Xian did not have enough trust in these personal bodyguards. Fan Xian waited for a moment before Su Wenmao climbed into the carriage. Rubbing his slightly red hands, he lowered his voice and reported, the third bureau has moved the files of the palace. Eunuch Yao went to the outskirts of the capital. This matter was not kept a secret, so the palace did not order the council to destroy the files. What did Lao Yao go to the outskirts of the capital for? Fan Xian asked curiously. Su Wenmao placed his palm across his throat and made a throat-slitting gesture. The eunuch who attacked the hanging temple last time, his adoptive parents are in a village in the outskirts of the capital. Eunuch Yao went to deal with this matter and left with the guards. Fan Xian furrowed his brows tightly. A moment later, he sighed and said, assassinating the emperor, that eunuch did not consider the consequences. He did not think, regardless of whether or not he succeeded, the relatives in the village would probably all die. The carriage slowly began to move. Su Wenmao saw that the commissioner's expression was a bit unhappy. He didn't understand why. Assassination was a great crime. This time, the palace had already controlled the scope of the punishment. Not implicating the 9 generations of the eunuch was already a benevolent policy. Sir, is benevolent. However, this kind of matter cannot be relaxed, Su Wenmao explained. Only a few dozen people died. Fan Xian was not a hypocrite. The discomfort in his heart had another reason. He said, I just hate that eunuch. He only wanted revenge and did not care about the kindness of his adoptive parents. Su Wenmao was surprised. A moment later, he said, to say something disgraceful, the death of one's father is absolutely irreconcilable. Naturally, that eunuch should be hacked into 1,000 pieces and his bones ground to dust. However, no one is surprised that he made this choice. Fan Xian was silent, but he laughed coldly in his heart. The Qin kingdom was founded by the emperor, and it emphasized the rule of filial piety. The law of the Qin kingdom stipulated that relatives should hide from each other, so he could be judged innocent. A look of disgust suddenly appeared between his brows. However, he could not say this to anyone beside him. He thought about how the eunuch, in order to avenge his father, had abandoned the hard work of his adoptive parents and sent them to their deaths. He felt that it was only right. What kind of dog-T logic was this? They arrived at the 28-li hill, and the carriage followed the long street. The brightly painted shop doors seemed to be welcoming Fan Xian's arrival. The carriage arrived in front of Qingyu Hall. Before Su Wenmao had time to hand over his visiting card, he heard a few squeaks. The large courtyard, which had not been opened for a long time, opened without hesitation to welcome the arrival of a certain someone. Today, the 17 shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall were not in their own rooms, nor were they in the manners of the various princes doing their accounts. Instead, they stood neatly at the door to welcome Fan Xian. Seeing Fan Xian step out of the carriage, the 17 of them knelt on the ground and bowed. Fan Xian hurriedly asked the shopkeepers to rise. He glanced at the familiar seventh in line and nodded with a smile. Shopkeeper Yi was nearly 50 years old, and his eyes were gentle. He knew that outside the door was not a place to talk, and he did not know why this young master dared to come in broad daylight. But he still maintained his calm. He gestured for Fan Xian to enter the hall and take a seat. Another servant went to greet the others. Gouda and the other two shook their heads. They were loyal to the emperor's strict orders and did not leave Fan Xian's side. Fan Xian used his gaze to indicate that Yi Dao was fine, and then he entered the middle hall. After taking a seat, he ordered Gouda and the other two to stand guard outside the door. At this time, there were no outsiders in the hall. The 17 shopkeepers were a little timid, a little scared, and a little excited. There were rumors outside that the young official in front of them was a descendant of the Yi family, the son of the lady. Heavens, if this was true, then Fan Xian must have come today to say something important. But Fan Xian was sitting in the seat of honor. If he was not willing to admit his identity, the shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall did not have the courage to hug his leg and cry. Fortunately, Fan Xian did not allow this kind of silence to continue for too long. After a moment of silence, he said, "Enji has come today because of the matter from a year and a half ago." Shopkeeper Yi had not expected Sir Fan Jr. to speak of this. He was surprised and looked at him in surprise. Fan Xian smiled and explained, "Back then, I had the intention of having my younger brother, Sijia, become a disciple of the head shopkeeper. However, the head shopkeeper was busy and did not inform me. So I had my younger brother bring cured meat to your door. Now, I do not know where my useless brother is, so naturally, there is no need to bring this matter up again. But, head shopkeeper, don't mention the other matter we talked about back then. You have also forgotten. How could Yida forget? That day, Fan Xian had secretly pointed out that he would be in charge of the palace treasury in the future, and had come to seek help from Qingyu Hall, allowing them the possibility of leaving the capital. Fan Xian's proposal made all of the attendants of Qingyu Hall very excited. If they could leave the capital and once again get close to the property the lady had left behind, of course, these shopkeepers would be happy. However, they had always been intimidated by the power of the emperor, and they did not dare to judge whether or not Fan Xian had the ability to persuade the palace. Most importantly, they did not know what Fan Xian's goal was and what he was thinking, so they did not take the initiative to give Fan Xian an explanation afterward. But who would have thought that the situation would change so wonderfully? First, Fan Xian had suddenly risen in power in a year and a half, becoming the most popular young official in Qin Kingdom, and his control of the palace treasury had become an ironclad matter. Now, there was a rumor that he was the son of the lady. If this matter was true, then Fan Xian's reason for gathering Qingyu Hall was very clear. Shopkeeper Yi coughed and said with a serious expression, "Sir, of course, we are very willing, but we do not know if the palace will allow it." Now, he no longer doubted Fan Xian's intentions, but he still doubted Fan Xian's ability. Fan Xian smiled and nodded. The hall exploded with a buzz. Shock and boundless joy appeared on the faces of the old and steady 17 shopkeepers. Ever since the Yi family had fallen, they had been placed under house arrest in Jingdo and had not been able to leave. Suddenly hearing such good news, how could they control themselves? Fan Xian took a sip of tea and looked at the childlike, innocent smiles of these 40- and 50-year-old shopkeepers. A very sincere smile also appeared on his face. Because of their mother, these people had been trapped in Jingdo in the prime of their youth. Now that he was able to do something for them, it made him very happy. Naturally, not all of them can go, Fan Xian warned. Their families also have to stay in the capital. The joyful and slightly crying shopkeepers paused and listened to him continue. After going to Jiangnan, let's take turns coming. Just think of it as a vacation. What do you all think? Only now did everyone know that Sir Fan Jr. was making a naughty joke. After a moment of surprise, they laughed loudly. Fan Xian gave a few more reminders, encouraging everyone to remember the Emperor's grace and do their best for the court. This nonsense was said for the tiger guards outside the door to hear. Only then did he quietly say, "Seventh Yi shopkeeper will have to trouble you to go with me this time. As for the rest of you, please discuss it among yourselves. However, you have to leave an older person in Jingdo." Seventh Yi was standing by his side and asked with furrowed brows. Fan Xian smiled and said, "Baiweb brothel will soon be empty. You all have to help me manage it. For such an ecstatic place, I can only ask an old and virtuous person to manage it." It was another cold joke, but the shopkeepers could only laugh bitterly. After a long time, the laughter finally died down, but for some reason, a different faint emotion grew in the hall. In reality, the shopkeepers were not seriously listening to what Fan Xian said. They were just looking at his appearance intently, trying to find something familiar about him. Although Fan Xian had not said it explicitly when he came today, his actions had already explained too much. Everyone, including shopkeeper Yi, had long believed that he was truly a descendant of a Yi family. Amidst the silence, shopkeeper Yi was in front. The other 13 shopkeepers stood in 2 rows behind him. Facing Fan Xian, who was sitting in the middle, they lifted their robes and knelt down in unison. "We will follow young master's orders. The after-effects of drinking too much, headache, it should be gone tomorrow. I am truly sorry." To be continued. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 332. The New Year's festival was Changchun, and it was the annual New Year's festival. Without a doubt, it was not delayed, but there was nothing new. This winter, Fan Xian had not spent most of his time in the Song Mountains. Furthermore, after the events that had occurred, Warner and Ruo had been frightened into returning to the capital. Everyone was present except for the second Fan, so Fan Manor was quite lively. There was a thick layer of red confetti in front of the mansion, like a big wedding carpet. The air was filled with the smell of smoke. It was a little pungent and a little sweet. The big and small kitchens were filled with fish and meat, which made the masters and servants feel that their lives were too blissful. Fortunately, the medicine that the young master caught was very effective. On the night of the New Year's Eve, the palace gave them a few large dishes and a few small trinkets. Fan Xian did not pay much attention to it. He was in his room having a difficult conversation with his wife and sister. After solving the confusion of the 2 ladies, he did not wait for them to wake up from their shock and endless confusion. He led them to the front house. After the New Year's Eve dinner was hastily eaten, the family gathered around and played a few rounds of mahjong. Fan Xian lay behind Warner and crossed his arms. From time to time, he would come up with some bad ideas and successfully lost a lot of money to the 2 elders. He purposely picked a few classic jokes from his previous life and finally managed to alleviate some of the strange feelings at the table. The next day, on the first day of the new year, the young people who had been keeping watch struggled to wake up and went to the front hall to pay their respects. Fan Xian was not careless at all. He knelt down on both knees, and under the strange gazes of the crowd, he was calm, as usual. He kowtowed to his father 3 times, and with 3 loud thuds, his forehead touched the ground. Old Master Fan stroked his beard and smiled. He was unspeakably comforted. The women went out to play with glutinous rice balls. On the first day of a new year, there were only a few bachelors left in the front hall. Fan Xian walked behind his father and gently massaged his shoulders. Ever since the rumors had spread, perhaps because he had broken through the demons in his heart, Fan Xian no longer kept himself behind a curtain. He began to express the emotions that a son should have. The distance between father and son seemed much closer than before. Minister of Revenue Fan Jian rested while enjoying his son's service. He asked, "How is Xizhou over there?" Fan Xian respectfully replied, "Not bad. Wang Qinian is a clever man." Fan Jian smiled slightly. "You know many people in northern Qi. I'm not worried about that." He suddenly shook his head and said, somewhat baffled, "It's strange in Xi. I see that you treat the northerners quite well, but don't forget that there's a death feud between our 2 countries that cannot be resolved. There's no harm in using them sometimes, but you can't trust them completely, especially not placing your last hope on them." Fan Xian was slightly startled. He didn't know if his father had guessed something. He chuckled and explained. Fan Jian suddenly asked with concern, "Old Fei treated your injuries. How are you now?" Fan Xian didn't want his father to worry, so he didn't tell him the truth about his Junqi dissipating. He nodded and said, "I'm almost healed. After 2 more months of rest, there shouldn't be anything to worry about." 2 more months? Fan Jian furrowed his brows and said, "Jiangnan is not like Jingdou. The mountains are high, the rivers are deep, and the emperor is far away. Your body is also not as good as it was in the past. You must be careful in everything you do. You cannot be like you have been these past 2 years, fighting to be the first in everything. Once you make a move, you must put the opponent to death." Fan Xian heard the worry in his father's words and also knew that his elder was reminding him. In the battles in the capital, Fan Xian had always been ruthless. Even when facing the eldest princess and second prince, he had never retreated. He had always been ruthless and bold. However, once he went to Jiangnan, faced the officials of the borders, and went deep into the headquarters of the Jiang and aristocratic families, although it seemed that no one could shake him in terms of power. Without his father and Shun Pingping behind him, he should do things more smoothly. Father and son exchanged opinions on the matters after the new year. They also made a sufficiently detailed analysis of what changes the eldest princess would bring to the court after she entered the capital. Fan Jian reminded Fan Xian that he should pay attention to who the scholar who would enter the cabinet after the new year. Fan Xian didn't understand what his father meant by specifically mentioning that literary master, but he still firmly remembered that person's name in his heart. Fan Jian gently patted the pair of steady and young hands on his shoulder and smiled slightly. "It looks like the Emperor is truly prepared to hand the Overwatch Council to you. In the future, when you're in the council, he will have to find a civil official in the court who can match your reputation and position. This is preparation for the future." When Who the Scholar led the change in the style of writing, he was just a young man in his early 20s. Now he was about 40 years old. In the south of the world, his literary name was flourishing. Before Fan Xian was born, he was truly in the limelight. However, in recent years, his official fortunes had not been smooth. He wandered from place to place among the 7 roads. His position was high, but he had no real power. Now that he had entered the capital, he became the head of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. Fan Xian smiled and shook his head. He didn't plan on interfering too much with court politics, and he certainly wouldn't provoke Who the Scholar. Presumably, he wouldn't take the initiative to provoke him. The father and son chatted a bit more. Fan Xian remembered that the clans still had to worship their ancestors today, so he asked probingly. Fan Xian turned his head and glanced at his son. He sighed and shook his head. He thought to himself that it was a rare thing for this child to have such intentions. However, he could show his intentions, but he couldn't have his name enter the family records. After all, he still had to worry about the face of that person in the palace. Fan Xian was just trying to see if there was such a possibility. Seeing that his father's reaction was very direct, he knew that he was still dreaming. He felt a bit uncomfortable in his heart. The morning sun shone warmly in the Fan family garden. Most of the people, including Minister Fan, Lady Lu, and Ro, had already gone to the Fan clan ancestral hall where the country estate was. Even the housekeepers, nannies, and serving girls had gone. At this moment, there were only a few people left in the front and back residences. It seemed particularly quiet. "I know you want to go," Wan sat by his side and comforted him in a quiet voice. Fan Xian was reading a book. The Dombo bookstore had printed the first batch of Zhuang's commentary collection. The name was given by Fan Xian, and the words were also written by Fan Xian. According to Seventh Yi, the sales were very good. The money was coming in faster than expected, particularly since the Northern Qi court had ordered 10,000 copies at once. It made Fan Xian's wallet bulge again. Hearing his wife's words, he smiled slightly and raised his head. Carelessly putting the book to one side, he made a sound of acknowledgement. "What? Worried I'll take things too hard?" Warner smiled and said, "Why aren't you worried that I'll take things too hard?" Fan Xian gently stretched out his arms and pulled her into his embrace. Sticking to her slightly cold face, he asked with concern, "How has your health been recently?" Wan misunderstood what he was talking about. Resting on his shoulder, her face showed a slightly worried expression. "There's still no movement." Fan Xian laughed out loud and said, "Who cares about that unborn daughter? I'm just asking how your health is. Sir Fei treated me the way he treats cows. Now I'm beginning to doubt his ability. There's nothing wrong with my body." Warner thought for a moment and then asked curiously, "Why a daughter?" "A daughter is good. She doesn't have to stand in court and fight battles every day," Fan Xian said with a smile. His way of thinking was, of course, very different from that of the people of this world. Lin Wan'er pulled away from Fan Xian. Pointed her heart, she giggled and said, "It's not good being a girl either. Marrying a husband and not knowing who he really is. It's not good here." Fan Xian's hand went straight to his wife's soft chest. With a serious expression, he said, "Let me see if the problem is serious." The couple joked around for a while, but they couldn't completely put that matter behind them. Wan'er faintly said, "Who would have thought that you were my cousin? Isn't that good?" Fan Xian smiled and said, "Sister Lin, let me hear you call me Brother Xian." Wan'er spat, "Bah, you're not Jia Baoyu." Fan Xian thought she was right. He was much prettier than Jia Baoyu. He rolled his eyes and left the room. Wan'er didn't know what he was going to do and was very curious. Unexpectedly, after a while, Fan Xian returned to the room. It was just that he was wearing tattered clothes that servants didn't often wear. Lin Wan'er looked at him dressed like a little beggar and couldn't help but burst out laughing. Fan Xian's eyes were wide open and his mouth was wide open. He happily said, "Cousin, aha, I've finally been waiting for you." Lin Wan'er was stunned. Why did her husband suddenly go crazy? Was it fun to call her cousin like that? She hesitated and asked, "Cousin?" Fan Xian laughed foolishly and said, "Ah, I'm your cousin, Hongqi." Lin Wan'er was dumbfounded. Hearing her husband speak nonsense with a Jiaozhou accent, she didn't know what to say for a long time. Fan Xian looked at her reaction and felt disheartened. Lowering his head like a defeated soldier, he went out to change his clothes. "Husband, earlier, what were you doing?" Imitating east to west. Fan Xian's face was bitter. Imitating show. It's what people in the South often call coquettish. Don't ask, just think of it as me being coquettish. Fan Xian's level of acting was actually very high. Ever since he was reborn into this world, he had begun to play the role of a naive child, an immortal poet, and a saint of love. Acting had always been his strong suit. If it weren't for this, he wouldn't have had the confidence to use such a passionate performance in the palace, in that little building, to deceive the unfathomable emperor. But people always needed rest, so he didn't want to hide too much in front of the people closest to him, such as his wife and his sister. After his past was exposed, Wan'er was shocked, but she gradually accepted reality. Suddenly, her husband had become her cousin. She only felt a wonderful romantic feeling of being closer to him. But for Ro, Her brother had suddenly become someone she didn't have any blood relations with. This was something she couldn't understand. So these days, Miss Fan had been intentionally or unintentionally avoiding Fan Xian, as if she didn't know how to face her brother. Her mind was restless. Even Fei Jie's classes were muddled. The manor didn't dare let her go to the Imperial Academy of Medicine to discuss the important matter of saving people with the old masters. Ruruo just hasn't come around. Wanner comforted. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. Am I not still her brother? This truth can't be changed. He closed his eyes and rested for a moment. He then said, after I leave, if things can settle down there, I'll take you there. As for my sister, I think she'll be leaving the capital soon. Hearing these words, Lin Wan was very happy. She clung to his shoulder and said, I heard the water in Jiangnan is good. The people born there are all like in a painting. I've never traveled far before. This time, I have to have a good time. Fan Xian teased, don't tell me you're going to see a handsome guy. Lin Wan couldn't resist such a naughty joke. Her incomparably round face immediately flushed red. Seeking death, she clenched her fists and punched Fan Xian's body. Fan Xian laughed and caught her pair of small fists. Seriously, he said, the eldest princess has returned to the capital. You have to go see her. Hearing this, all sorts of feelings welled up in Lin Wan'er's heart. Her soft intestines were tangled. She didn't know how to deal with this relationship. Fan Xian comforted her. I know this is very difficult, but you have to learn to tear this piece of paper in half. We don't cross each other's paths and each have our own business. This matter could not be resolved with comfort and persuasion. Fan Xian also understood this, so he could only drop it and not talk about it. On the contrary, it was Wan'er who braced herself and worried about the palace treasury matter on his behalf. Husband, even if you take all of the shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall, I'm afraid you won't be able to control the palace treasury in the shortest amount of time. After all, Mother has run it for so many years. Most of the local officials in Jiangnan have to look to her. She hesitated for a moment and then said seriously, particularly if you take the Yi family elders to Jiangnan, it will easily cause discussion among the people and the court. Fan Xian nodded and calmly said, I also understand, but this matter must be done. The shopkeepers have all been managing the businesses of the manors and manors these years. I also don't completely understand what they are thinking and whether or not they can trust me. However, those things in the palace treasury, if it weren't for them, it would be impossible. The reason the court has kept a close eye on them these years is because they understand the manufacturing process of the palace treasury. This information is of utmost importance to the court. They cannot allow the knowledge in their minds to spread to northern Qi or Dongyi. However, the various businesses of the palace treasury always require technical guidance. That is how they have managed to preserve their lives. Lin Wan'er was silent for a while, then quietly said, Don't look at how these shopkeepers seem to move about freely in the capital. In reality, they have people following them for many years. If they show any signs of leaking secrets, the people around them will immediately kill them. Fan Xian said with slight surprise, I can guess that. However, I don't know which side those people are from. I've checked in the council. The Overwatch Council is only responsible for the periphery. The person responsible for silencing them was not found. They are people from the palace, Lin Wan'er said with a worried expression. They will probably follow you to Jiangnan. The eunuch subordinates? Fan Xian smiled comfortingly. Ever since he entered the capital, he had a good relationship with the eunuchs in the palace. Regardless of which palace or which faction the eunuchs belonged to, they all deeply regarded Commissioner Fan as a close friend. Don't worry about these things, he said after thinking for a bit. He thought for a bit and then said, although the matter of the palace treasury has not been carried out, the general situation is already set. Your brother Shirdu probably does not have much of a chance. The battle between the princes will not surface again for at least a few years. I think this is what the emperor is most grateful to me for, although he did not say it. Lin Wan sighed and gazed at her husband in a daze. A moment later, she faintly said, Don't think of things so simply. In my opinion, the emperor just doesn't like his sons making a ruckus. As for what exactly he is thinking, who knows? Take the second brother, for example. Even if he is currently confined at home, who knows if he will suddenly make a comeback in the future? Fan Xian's heart froze as he listened to his wife continue her analysis. The Emperor is a very special person. Lin Wanner opened her eyes wide, revealing a completely different intelligence and craftiness than usual. He is a ruler of a generation who crawled out of blood and fire. His greatest characteristic is his self-confidence, extreme self-confidence. He doesn't believe that there is anything in the world that can truly shake his position. Thus, the battle for imperial power only brings him annoyance. It's just that as a father, he doesn't want to see his own flesh and blood fighting each other. I think he doesn't care about the title that the crown prince has. Who inherits the throne in the future will actually depend on what he thinks in his heart and how his brothers perform in the years to come. Even these things are not important to the Emperor. Lin Wanner continued in a quiet voice. Uncle's health is good, and he is not old. He thinks he can still live for many years. He has never thought about the problem of passing on the throne. His thoughts are actually still on the world. His ambition still exists. Fan Xian's temple throbbed. You can't let the Empress Dowager think that you are purposely trying to instill something into him. In addition, you have to investigate the case quickly and can't drag it out. If it drags out for too long, your days won't be easy. Mother does not only have the second prince and the imperial censorating court. Fan Xian was startled. Lin Wanner's heart struggled for a long time before she quietly said, "Perhaps everyone thinks that she was on good terms with the Eastern Palace in the past, only to hide the second prince's smoke bomb. But you have to be on guard. Perhaps one day, the crown prince will lean toward her side again." After a moment of silence, Fan Xian became gloomy. The ways of the world made his own wife sink into such a pitiful situation. He knew that the Eastern Palace would not watch him grow up. This had to do with the hatred of the past. However, he had not thought that the eldest princess would be so good at dancing and acting like a two-timing ace. Thinking of that amusing mother-in-law, Fan Xian couldn't help but smile. On the first day of a new year, ancestors were worshipped. On the second day, a large group of officials from the capital swarmed to the door to give New Year greetings. On the third day, the entire Fan Manor escaped and hid in King Jing's manor for a gathering. Fan Xian and Crown Prince Hongsheng awkwardly met to reminisce. On the fourth day, Ren Shaoan and Xian Shuwu jointly invited Fan Xian to a day of feasting as a farewell. On the fifth day, the Yin father and son went to the Fan Manor. After Yin Ruohai had resigned, he was quite fond of Go and played with the minister until the sky darkened. Fan Xian and Yin Bingyun talked in secret in the little study until the sky darkened. On the sixth day, they visited Chen Garden. On the seventh day, tens of thousands of people went out in Jingdou. Chickens did not crow, dogs did not bite, and 18-year-old girls ran through the streets. Fan Xian took his wife, sister, Ro Jia, and Yi Linger, the four young ladies, and ran amok in the capital. On the eighth day, at noon, the Duke's manor invited them. At dusk, the Fan clan gathered. Fan Xian became the focus of the banquet. After the 15th day of the first month, Fan Xian left the capital. A group of people came to the dock south of Jingdou. This river was called the Wei River. The Lu Jing River flowed into it. A few hundred leagues south of the Wei River would merge into the Great River. Following the river, they would arrive in Jiangnan, which was even more prosperous than Jingdou. Fan Xian followed the plan he had discussed with the Emperor. To the outside world, he only said he was going back to Danzhou to see his grandmother, and then he would go to Jiangnan. To outsiders, this trip and return meant that he would not arrive in Suzhou until at least March. No one thought he would arrive earlier. Leaving the capital today, Fan Xian did not have anyone send him off, including the officials he was familiar with in the council and the officials in court. He had not expected that the students of the Imperial College would know the news ahead of time and all come to the dock. Fan Xian had not held a position in the Imperial College for long, but he had always been very amiable. Last year, during the spring examinations, he had spent a large amount of silver to arrange for countless poor students. He had also uncovered the cheating case of the spring examinations and opened the eyes of the scholars under heaven. As for the poetry talks in front of the palace and the gifts of books by people, all of this added together to make his position in the hearts of the scholars high and not far off. His reputation was excellent. After he entered the Overwatch Council as commissioner, he had dealt with a number of bribery cases. While he was rectifying, he had played some small tricks in the light. Thus, the darkness of the Overwatch Council did not cause his brilliance to be greatly diminished. As for the later case of his past, it was strange. In reality, scholars often considered themselves to be virtuous and did not take pride in their family background. When they learned that the leader of their group, that poet Sir Fan Jr., actually had such a glorious and splendid background, the scholars did not feel the slightest bit of conflict in their hearts. On the contrary, they felt an unbearably sour and proud feeling. So what if he was an official? So what if he was a merchant? The leader of us scholars is also a prince. On the pier, whether it was the instructors or the students of the Imperial College, when faced with this scene of parting, they all felt a sense of regret. For a moment, the pier was a boiling cauldron of voices. It was very lively. In the end, Fan Xian drank 3 cups of wine in a row before he finally returned the favor of the scholars. The scene was very lively and glorious. Presumably, it would not be long before the news spread throughout the court. With great difficulty, he managed to persuade the crowd to leave. Fan Xian gently held Wanner's hands and carefully warned her countless times. He also said that he would send someone to pick her up when spring warmed up. Only then did Wanner's tears stop. Wanner watched the distant scholars leave. She suddenly laughed and teased. "Did you tell them?" Fan Xian's cheeks reddened a little. He explained, "I was fulfilling their beautiful wishes." He turned his head to look and saw his sister hiding behind the family servant girls. Her head was bowed, and she did not speak. She did not want to come forward. It was clear that she was secretly crying. Seeing the girl's cowering appearance, Fan Xian did not know why his anger rose for no reason. He pushed aside the people who were sending them off and came in front of Ruo. He shouted, "What are you crying for?" Ruo did not expect her brother to come directly in front of her. She jumped in fright and quickly wiped the tears from the corners of her eyes. She stuttered, No, nothing." She suddenly thought that it had already been more than 10 years. Her brother had never been so fierce to her. How could he be so fierce today? After all, he was not her biological brother. He was not as gentle to her as he had been in the past. Thinking of this, she, who was as elegant as a chrysanthemum, could not help but feel sad. Tears flowed from her eyes, but she stubbornly bit her lower lip. She felt an indescribable sense of tragedy. Seeing his sister like this, Fan Xian was so angry that he laughed. He gritted his teeth and did not know what to do. The servants beside him also quickly moved out of the way. They did not dare to stay next to these 2 masters of the fan manor. Fortunately, Wanner came over at this time. She hugged Ruo and quietly comforted her. She also said that Fan Xian was in a bad mood after leaving the capital, which was why he was so fierce. Only then did Ruo gradually calm down. Fan Xian was fierce because he could not bear to see his sister sad and purposely avoid him. The anger he had suppressed for the past 10 days was very strong. Seeing his sister looking at him with lingering fear, he sighed in his heart. Softening his voice, he said, "It is natural for me to be fierce to you. I am your brother, and you're my sister. If I am not fierce to you, you should be sad." Ruo was also an exceptionally intelligent person. Hearing this, she understood the so-called close and distant relationship. If her brother did not see her as his own sister, why would he be fierce to her in front of so many people? The girl thought this through, and a glimmer of happiness appeared on her face. She said to Fan Xian, Then seeing your brother go on a long journey, it is inevitable that you will be sad. Why are you so fierce?" She raised her head and spoke boldly. "Ha ha!" Fan Xian finally laughed. He knew that the knot in his sister's heart had been resolved, and his heart was full of comfort. "Master, if we don't leave now, we will miss the time." On the large ship beside the dock, the servant girl Cece stood with her hands on her hips and shouted loudly at the head of the ship. Fan Xian was going to Jiangnan, so he always had a few close attendants at his side. Cece had followed him since Danzhou, so she was the first choice. Once this girl left the Fan Manor, she returned to the time in Danzhou. Her entire person seemed to brighten. Wanner watched her shout loudly and couldn't help but smile. "Husband, you really spoil this girl rotten." Fan Xian laughed and quietly reminded his sister of some important matters that were about to reach Jingdou. He then, in a shocking manner, pulled Wanner into his arms and fiercely kissed her a few times. Only then did he wave his sleeve and board the large ship by the river. As the saying goes, I wave my sleeve and take away all the silver. Sir Fan Jr.'s departure from the capital had long become the topic of conversation for everyone in Jingdou. Regardless of whether it was in the taverns, tea houses, or deep mansions, they were all discussing this matter. The second prince, who was under house arrest in his manor, listened to the report of his subordinate strategist and sighed. That bastard has finally left. The strategist had no plans and said hatefully, "It's a good thing he left quickly. Otherwise, I would have skinned him to help your highness vent your anger." The second prince was squatting on a chair, scooping out frozen milk soup to eat. Hearing this, he furrowed his brows and didn't speak for a long time. He smiled self-mockingly and faintly said, "No wonder people always say that I am similar to Commissioner Fan. So there is such a story behind it. However, the resemblance is one thing. I'm not a match for him. You all have to be clear on this point." He jumped off the chair and looked at the free sky outside the courtyard. A sweet smile rose to his face. That bastard has finally left. It feels so good, like someone has taken away the poisonous snake behind me. 300 li outside Jingdou, an absurdly long group was slowly moving west. The woman from Xinyang's Li Palace was walking on her way back to the capital. She didn't know that her son-in-law had also chosen to escape Jingdou on this day. Toward her kind expression and attempt to negotiate peace, the other party's reaction was to avoid it. Inside the solemn temple of Qing, 3 li away, there was an extremely desolate yard. In the middle of the yard, there was a tall pile of dry firewood burning fiercely. The fire was so strong that it made the things inside crackle. The emperor held his hands behind his back and looked coldly at the pile of firewood. He looked at the body inside that was gradually turning into black smoke. Behind him, the great priest of the Qing kingdom maintained the calm of an ascetic monk, but fear rose in his eyes. Outside the Qing temple, the eunuch Hongzhu was chatting with the guards. Tomorrow, he would be transferred to the empress's palace as the head eunuch. Today should be the last time he would serve the emperor. A few days later, on the Wei River, Fan Xian stood at the bow of the boat and was silent for a long time. The chilly river surface hit him in the face, but it could not blow into the expensive fur clothing he wore. He had already left the capital, but the reports were still coming in. The eldest princess had sent many scouts into the capital and had the old servant bring many of the specialties of Xinyang to Fan Manor. Nominally, they were for Wanner. It seemed that his mother-in-law had finally acknowledged Fan Xian's power after her failed attempts at assassination had been futile. She had begun to repair the relationship between mother and daughter. This was only a minor detail and did not fall within the scope of the world that Chun Pingping had taught him. What truly interested Fan Xian was the news that the great priest of the Qing kingdom had returned to the country after many years. Because of his bitter training in the south, he had used up all of his essence and blood and died of old age. At the same time, he found out that Hongzhu had been transferred to the empress's palace as the head eunuch. He was somewhat disappointed, but also somewhat happy. His student, Shi Changli, used his hand to shield his eyes from the harsh river wind. He came to his side and asked, "Teacher, earlier the captain on the boat said that based on our current speed, we can pass Jingzhou tomorrow. In a few days, we will enter the territory of Jiangnan Road." The Jiangnan group changed boats at a secret dock in the Overwatch Council not far from the capital. The boat they were on was a common navy boat modified into a civilian boat. Facing the river wind, it was as if they could faintly see the picturesque lakes and mountains of Jiangnan. Fan Xian was slightly startled. He nodded and smiled. Little sure, although the beauties of Jiangnan are waiting for your attention, there is no need to rush. Sure, Chanli's expression became awkward. Daiwa Brothel's business was going to expand to Jiangnan, so both he and Sangwon had to go. Sangwon could drag it out until March, but as Fan Xian's student, he did not dare to drag it out. He thought of his good friends and classmates from Tongfu Tavern. They were all now officials in Jiangnan, while he was going to become a world-famous brothel owner. He did not feel good in his heart. Traveling on the river in the cold and frozen weather was indeed a bit irritating. Sangwon had the good fortune of being kept by Director Chun, but the other person's luck was not so good. He had been forcefully ordered out of the palace by his own father and did not have to wait until the warm spring flowers bloomed. The third prince timidly lifted the thick curtain of the boat and looked at Fan Xian. Sir Sai, time to eat. The reason Fan Xian had the right to educate the prince was because he still had the status of Sai of the Imperial College, so the third prince called him that. Fan Xian turned his head and looked at the 8 or 9-year-old child. His smile carried a sinister coldness. Has your Highness finished your homework? I still have to dig into the details of the Jiangnan trip, so tomorrow this chapter will be shorter. To be continued. If you want to know what happens next, please go to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 333. Yingzhou was located to the north of the Great River and coincidentally surrounded by countless mountains and rivers. To the east was the rich and populous land of Jiangnan. Looking to the northwest was the strategic location of Jingdou in the center of the Qin Kingdom. This prefecture was not far from the 2 most prosperous places in the Qin Kingdom. It also happened to be at the intersection of the Wei River and the Great River. Although the high mountains and precipitous ridges on both sides of the river brought many inconveniences to transportation, with the river on the side and the center transportation, logically speaking, it should be a place where merchants gathered, busy, and the people lived happily. However, the present Yingzhou appeared somewhat run down. It was not that the scenery was dim or the houses were old. It was just that the people walking on the streets had heavy and lifeless expressions. The vendors on the side of the street did not raise their spirits. The pancakes, fruits, all seemed to have gone cold and wilted. Even the docks outside the city were not very lively. Most of the ships that traveled up and down the Qin Kingdom's river chose to dock at the docks downstream and abandoned this place. There were only a few scattered ships at the docks. This made one of them, which was almost new, particularly eye-catching. The reason Yingzhou had become like this was because of the heavens. Last year, the Great River had flooded and broken through the dam upstream. Yellow waves flowed straight into the plains, drowning countless people and destroying countless houses. Fortunately, the weather had cooled quickly after the disaster, so there were no major epidemics. However, this kind of bone-breaking torment made all of Yingzhou appear lifeless. The second strange official, this Yingzhou Zhizhou, was once the emperor's disciple, but he did not receive any of the emperor's blessings. All day long, he only knew how to be a tyrant in the city, curry favor with the higher-ups, and bully the merchants and common people. He could not even maintain normal public order, let alone repair the river. He only knew how to collect exorbitant taxes and miscellaneous taxes. Furthermore, it was rumored that this Zhizhou had connections with the mountain bandits in the mountains across the river. With such a governor of a province, the people's lives withered. Merchants moved stealthily, and proper merchants could not wait to hide. Who dared to stay in the city? The third strange official. The people of Yingzhou were valiant. Since ancient times, they had a glorious tradition of carrying a hoe to fight against the government. With such a ghost official, there were more and more poor commoners going down the river and up the mountain. However, the situation seemed to have changed a lot this year. First, the Yingzhou Zhizhou had been invited to tea by the inspection division of the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council stationed in the city. Just as the people of Yingzhou rejoiced in their hearts and thought the Zhizhou was finally about to fall, he was respectfully sent back by the Overwatch Council. Just as people thought in disappointment that Yingzhou would continue to decline like this Zhizhou died. The people from Jingdou investigated for a long time before confirming that the Zhizhou's death had nothing to do with any conspiracy. He had simply died of illness. On the day the Zhizhou died, the people of Yingzhou silently lit countless strings of firecrackers. Naturally, no one dared to say it was to celebrate the death of the god of plagues. Those who did not know the inside story thought the people of Yingzhou had chosen this day to collectively get married. Another change was that the mountain bandits on the other side of the river seemed to have become a lot more well-behaved. The largest mountain stronghold seemed to have been massacred within a day, and the mountain bandits were scattered. It was said that a great figure of Jianghu had come from Jiangnan and was trying to subdue this group of forces. The people of Yingzhou were not happy for long. They thought they had celebrated the Little New Year early. Because the Zhizhou had died, the court would send another Zhizhou next year. Once the mountain bandits collapsed, there would immediately be another large group of mountain bandits. The lives of the common people would still be so difficult. There would not be any fundamental change. In a storeroom by the dock, a dozen or so laborers were gathered together discussing something. No matter how quiet the dock was, chatting in broad daylight was not the professional attitude that laborers should have. Furthermore, the vicious expressions on their faces seemed to reveal their other identity. Surrounded in the middle was a woman. She was about 20 years old and had regular features. She could not be considered a beauty, but there was a hint of ruthlessness in her eyes. When she opened her mouth, the men around her obediently closed their mouths. It looked like she was the leader. We found out. It's a team merchant from Jingdou. Sister Guan, they have guards on their boat, one of the laborers reminded. The person called Sister Guan was a famous bandit leader near Yingzhou. She had not been in Yingzhou for long, but she had already gathered a large group of powerful bandit leaders. It was rumored that she had a powerful background. Sister Guan smiled coldly and said, "They're just some merchants. What's so important? Besides, you've all gone to check it out. I don't need to tell you how heavy the boxes in the back room are, do I?" Her words were calm, but once the boxes were mentioned, the eyes of the laborers began to burn. Walking on the Jianghu, true mountain bandits looked at the dust on the wheels of a carriage to determine the weight of the goods inside, and from there, their value. The mountain bandits near Yingzhou were actually part of the same class as pirates. They were most skilled at determining what exactly was on the boat from the depth of the water it took. Yesterday, a large ship had suddenly stopped on the dock. The hull was about 80% new. Looking at the thickness of the moss on the horizontal planks of the ship, the people who spent a lot of time on the dock knew that this ship had not been in the water for a long time. Nowadays, it was rare to see this kind of large ship in Yingzhou. For the mountain bandits, this was a rare fat sheep. Taking advantage of the time when the people on the ship disembarked to buy food, vegetables, and water, there were already people who had clearly investigated the situation on the ship. What confused these bandits was, since it was a team merchant, why would there be such heavy goods in the back of the ship? As a result, the draft of the ship was clearly different from that of the ships they usually saw. This question was finally answered after a kitchen woman, who was acting as an informant, came on board. In the heavily guarded room at the back of the ship, there was a box. Looking at the strength of the planks of the ship and the faint scratches on the iron key in the compartment, the bandits' sharp eyes discovered that the box was filled to the brim with silver. No one would bring so much silver to Jiangnan to buy tea. Sister Guan actually still had some misgivings in her heart. However, since the young master wanted to subdue the mountain bandits near Yingzhou, he had to do a few large transactions and let these sweaty, smelly bandits smell something. Furthermore, what the young master wanted to do after spring did indeed require silver. Otherwise, she would not be in such a hurry to rob ships everywhere. One of the mountain bandits also felt that the matter was strange and said, "The ship is deep in the water, and there is no cargo on the ship. Perhaps there are river stones on the bottom of the ship," and third sister-in-law didn't see clearly. Sister Guan shook her head and said, "It's not a ship. Why would it need ballast stones? I just find it strange that the merchant on that big ship, why would he bring so much cash?" "Cash is good." A mountain bandit laughed strangely and said, He stole the banknotes but didn't dare to go get them. These words were immediately echoed by his companions. They all laughed in unison, and their laughter was full of greed. Sister Guan furrowed her brows and said, "The problem is nowadays, which merchant would bring cash? Are they not worried about the problem of safety?" The mountain bandits looked at Sister Guan and thought that this leader did things shrewdly and fiercely. She also picked her targets very accurately. Taking advantage of the fact that there was no one in Jizhou, she had led her brothers to commit a few major crimes. However, sometimes she was a bit too careful. The problem of safety should be asked by that stupid tea merchant. Why ask her brothers? Sister Guan waved her hand to summon the third sister-in-law, who was responsible for gathering information. The third sister-in-law's face was dark and thin. She said fawningly, "Don't worry. There are only a dozen or so guards on the ship, along with a servant girl and a child. The master is a young man who is too weak to stand up to a gust of wind. His appearance is beautiful, but he doesn't know how to hide it at all. Presumably, he is some rich but useless second generation in the capital who was sent to Jiangnan by his elders to hone himself. Bringing a servant girl. Presumably the young merchant couldn't stand the loneliness of the night." Sister Guan laughed coldly and relaxed slightly. If that tea merchant was really someone with a heart, he wouldn't have brought a woman to float on the river. Perhaps he really was a useless second generation who thought that shiny silver was more comfortable than throwing banknotes. As for the dozen or so guards, they were not in her eyes. The dozen or so brothers under her were all fierce bandits with many lives on their hands. She believed that when they boarded the ship at night, those guards could only choose to die or jump into the river. The mountain bandits beside her looked at each other and suddenly laughed extremely lewdly. "Sister Guan, when the matter is done tonight, reward us with the servant girl." Sister Guan blinked and revealed a trace of disdain. "Look at you all. As long as you get the silver, everything else is up to you." She paused and laughed. Her laughter was incomparably cold and evil. "Clean your hands and feet. Don't leave anyone alive. After this is done, take the ship to Arrow Beach and burn it." The night outside of Yingzhou was very quiet. The moon on the mountain across the river shone coldly on the surging river. It seemed to have calmed the roar of the river. There were a few lonely boats moored at the dock. It was past midnight, the time when people were sleeping soundly. The lights on the boats had long been extinguished, and the merchants had long since fallen asleep. Under the gentle brush of the moonlight, a dozen or so black shadows silently touched the shore and dove into the river. After swimming to the largest boat, they took out hooks and ropes from their bodies. Some of them were empty-handed and climbed up the ropes. They were like countless monkeys that had been drenched in water. Their movements were incomparably agile. In just a moment, these mountain bandits had already touched the large boat and disappeared into the darkness. Sister Guan held a cold knife in her mouth and silently climbed to the second floor. Using the cover of the shadow of the cabin, she moved directly to the back. In the warehouse, everyone had discussed clearly and knew the layout of the boat like the back of their hands. She knew that the chest full of silver was at the back of the cabin. In the darkness behind her, there was a faint poochie sound. Immediately after, someone fell on the deck with a soft thud. She frowned, thinking that these little bastards didn't know how to be more careful. If all the guards were alerted at the same time, although she wasn't afraid, it would still be troublesome. Outside the side room, unexpectedly, there were no guards. At this time, in the darkness of the night, there were a few more muffled groans. Sister Guan knew that her subordinates were gradually invading the middle cabin. Her heart slightly calmed. She hooked her finger on the door and used the tip of the knife to gently open the cabin door. In the next moment, she had already felt a chest in the darkness. Using the faint afterglow from the window in front of her, Sister Guan could clearly see the size of the chest. She couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air. Third sister-in-law didn't say clearly. She only said that based on the size and weight of the chest, it was estimated to be over 1,000 taels, but Sister Guan didn't dare to believe it. She touched the chest and estimated the size. Heavens, How much silver would it take to fill such a large chest? She suddenly felt some lingering fear. To be able to carry so much silver with him. Even if he was a spoiled brat, he was probably the wealthiest spoiled brat in the capital. Once this matter was exposed, she was afraid that the young master behind her would not be able to bear the wrath of the capital. Don't kill that second generation. This was the first thought that welled up in Sister Guan's heart. But she immediately realized that what was done could not be undone. She couldn't help but hesitate. Moreover, this much silver was enough to do many things. She carefully felt around for a tool. After a long time, she finally opened the chest. A silver light suddenly spilled over the entire cabin. Sister Guan stared dumbfounded at the chest in front of her. Her face was full of shock and disbelief. Even though she was a person who lived on the edge of a knife and was used to seeing silver stained with blood, tonight she was still dazzled by the neat and tidy silver ingots in the chest. Her normally callous eyes began to reveal a greedy look, but she immediately became alert. No matter how bright the moonlight was, no matter how beautiful the silver was, it couldn't possibly emit such an alluring light. She suddenly turned her head and saw a middle-aged man with a serious face. He held a white light in one hand and a strangely long padao in the other. He was looking at her coldly. Tiger Gargao had already followed Fan Xian's orders and given Sister Guan enough time to admire the silver. He very slowly chopped down with his padao. Sister Guan raised her padao. But that slow, long padao was like an unstoppable flood. In a flash, it broke through the defense and heart of this female bandit. While she was frightened out of her wits, she watched in agony as her left hand was chopped off. Fresh blood gushed out with pain. The lights in the middle cabin of the ship were lit. Sister Guan, who had been dragged into the room, had her hair in a mess and her mood in a mess. All the bandits who had followed her aboard had been easily disarmed and knocked unconscious. They were tied up and thrown neatly on the deck. A few black-clothed swordsmen of the 6th Bureau who were on night duty acted as if nothing had happened. They stood guard in all 4 directions. She raised her head. Through her hair, she looked at the tired and annoyed handsome young man sitting on the chair. For some reason, her heart shivered. Who exactly lived on this ship? To be able to use so many aces as guards. And the person who had used the padao earlier was actually a master of the knife. At this moment, she naturally understood that the young prodigal son third sister-in-law spoke of was certainly not an ordinary tea merchant. Guan Wume. The young man on the chair glanced at the female bandit who had lost an arm, but still had a fierce expression on her face. He yawned and asked with a face full of interest. The young man was Fan Xian. He had stopped the ship in Yingzhou to deal with the aftermath of Hongzhu's matter. He hadn't expected that he would provoke some blind little bandits. However, he could tell at a glance that the woman in front of him was the female bandit in the Overwatch Council's files. He couldn't help but feel happy. He hadn't thought about how to start the Jiangnan matter, and now one had delivered itself to his door. You're tuning into the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.